Hello everyone. I am your dark narrator here to guide you today. I know many of you use this video to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also drop a comment letting us know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now settle in, get comfortable, and relax. You always give back what you take out. The single line of black type was the only blemish on the thick, cream-colored card I was handed as I entered the mansion's front foyer. The man handing them out, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored suit the same color as the card, was solemn in his work, but that didn't stop Jonas from giving a laugh and patting the man on the shoulder as he took his card. The man shook from the impact of Jonas's meaty hand, but his expression remained unchanged. Seeming disappointed, Jonas turned to me and rolled his eyes before pulling me into one of the parlors off the main hall where people were talking. I had met Jonas 6 weeks earlier when he contacted me after buying one of my paintings from a gallery downtown. He said he was an art collector and had been very impressed with my work. Did I have more he could see and perhaps buy? Yes, of course I did. Would I meet him for lunch one day and bring my portfolio? Yes, of course I would. In the weeks since that first lunch, we became friends and Jonas became a patron of sorts. He bought 5 more of my paintings, but he also started talking about me needing an actual studio rather than just painting out of a spare room in my apartment. I was always leery things were going to veer toward strangeness or turn sexual, but it never did. He never really asked anything of me at all until this party, and it never even occurred to me to refuse. He didn't tell me much going in, other than it was a social club of ultra-wealthy people that was kind of weird. No orgies or anything like that, he assured, and it was up to me how much I participated in any activity. But his precautionary preamble was enough to make me intrigued without really being worried. Once inside and mingling, I began looking for signs of strangeness, but found few. The oddest thing was that it looked like no one was drinking anything other than water. When I asked Jonas about it, he said alcohol was discouraged at these things, as it could dilute or corrupt the experience. What was the experience? Jonas just gave me a melodramatic lift of the eyebrows and a wink. We talked to a few people, all clearly wealthy, a couple I even recognized from some article or television show. Then an announcement was made to come into the main ballroom. People filtered from our and several other rooms, coming together into a large room lit by 2 massive crystal chandeliers and bare of adornment, except for a large platform towards the far end of the rectangular room. It is near this platform that the 40 or 50 of us gathered, being beckoned up by a small woman who stood atop it at a podium. She welcomed us all, saying that per custom, 7 people had been pre-designated for tonight's journey, and everyone else had been put into the random pool for the remaining 3 slots. She asked those 3 to come up first, each holding up a black stone that apparently indicated their right to participate. When she asked for the remaining 7, Jonas chuckled and grabbed my arm, guiding us to the front. I was starting to get nervous now, and I wanted to ask questions, but there was little time and I didn't want to make Jonas angry or embarrass him in front of his weird friends. So I kept quiet as we were ushered through the heavy double doors behind the podium. We were in a smaller room that was empty except for 2 lamps and 3 men that were clearly some kind of guards. The woman gestured to the men and they proceeded to open the only other door in the room. This door was of metal and was locked by both an electronic lock tied to a keypad and 3 bar locks that even the large guards had to grunt to slide out of place. When the doors began to crack open, I could feel cool air rush out to greet us, scentless but carrying a strange weight about it. The woman let us in, and that's when I first saw the body. It had been a middle-aged woman and was dressed in a gauzy white dress. She had brown hair streaked with gray that cascaded down onto the stone dais she was laid out upon. Her skin was pale and clean, and at a glance she could have just been asleep. But at more than a glance, that clearly wasn't right. She was too still, too inanimate. I couldn't help myself at this point. I leaned over to Jonas and asked if that woman was dead. He nodded, continuing to talk as the woman gestured for one of their group to come forward. Jonas told me in lowered tones that the body was over 500 years old, but had never decayed. It happened sometimes, he said. Such bodies were called incorruptible, and it was sometimes viewed as a sign of sainthood. This woman, he said, had been a miller's wife in Eastern Europe and had apparently just dropped dead one day. They didn't embalm the body, of course, but it still did not rot. Eventually, it was claimed by a local church, and a small monastery had been built around it for a time before it changed hands and ultimately wound up here. But why? I asked. He pointed to the front where the woman had spread open a slit in the dress to expose the flesh of the body's stomach. This process, Jonas said, was called wet cupping. It was commonly used as a form of alternative medicine on the living, but it had been discovered that if it was used to extract fluids from an incorruptible body, the fluids could be drank to various effects. I felt myself involuntarily jerk back. I could tell by his expression, which was much different than his normal relaxed and jolly face, that he was serious. What effects? I asked. Visions, euphoria, intellectual and artistic breakthroughs. It was kind of like acid, but without any risk of brain damage or long-term physical harm. And while some people did have bad trips, it was pretty rare. While he was talking, I was watching the procedure unfolding before us. The woman had several tiny glass cups on a table nearby. With practiced precision, she took a small metal tool that almost looked like a toothbrush to 10 different spots on the skin. As she did so, a black liquid would begin to well from the spot, and she would apply a cup, which had some mechanism on it to vacuum seal it to the flesh. By the time she was done, all 10 of the small cups were filling with the black liquid. She then went back to the first one, slid a thin piece of metal underneath its edge with amazing speed, and righted the cup. Wiping down its sides with a cloth, she handed the brimming cup of black ichor to the first participant, an older Hispanic woman. The woman's wrinkled nose told me of the smell a moment before I smelled it myself. The scent was of dead flowers and decay, and I felt my gorge rising. I wanted to tell her not to drink it, but it was too late. After her, the rest followed in turn, including Jonas himself. They all seemed okay, and Jonas said that while it smelled terrible, it didn't taste bad, and it was perfectly safe. The woman handed me my glass and they all waited, staring at me expectantly. I'd like to say that I told them no, that I handed it back, or threw it to the ground, or told them I wanted to leave, but I didn't. I was scared and weak. I didn't want to lose Jonas's friendship or his patronage, and I could feel that I was on the precipice of something. So I held my breath and I drank it. Jonas was right, it didn't taste bad. I felt it slide down my throat like some kind of foul milkshake, and then it was gone. I braced myself for some kind of reaction, but none came. When I looked questioningly at Jonas, he was grinning. Clapping me on the back, he told me that I'd done great, that it would probably be a bit before it kicked in. We all retired to a room filled with sofas and chairs, and while the other guests, the non-participants, were around, they kept a respectful distance. I felt my head getting lighter as I sat on an overstuffed leather sofa in a dim corner of the room. My vision began to dilate, and then the room fell away entirely. I was flying through some dark maelstrom, and I sensed it was the land of the dead, or at least one of them. I felt my body pick up speed as it hurtled downward through black clouds and purple arcs of lightning, and before long I could see the ground below me. As my descent slowed, I found myself shooting out across the landscape, gray, ashy lands of bare earth giving way to dark forests, then to massive cities carved of towering red monoliths of crimson rock and dark sinew. I began to scream and cry from joy and terror, and then I was back in the room. I looked at my phone, and only a few minutes had passed. Jonas dropped me off at home in the early hours of the morning. He had told me he was proud of me, that he had wanted to see how it would affect an artist of my caliber, and not to tell him, but to show him what I had experienced through my work. Over the next few months, I began doing just that. I was painting at an incredible pace, filling canvases with depictions of the things I had seen and images I continued to see in my dreams. Jonas bought many of them, but he was not alone. He bought me a new studio that had room for a full gallery, and by the end of the first year I was selling paintings as fast as I could finish them. In many ways, that time and the months that followed have been the best of my life. I wish I could say I had enjoyed them more, but most of my time has been spent feeding my drive to paint, as though I'm trying to express corruption out of a wound. Still, I have become very successful doing the thing I'm most passionate about, so I wasn't about to complain. Yesterday morning, 3 men broke into my studio and kidnapped me. They zip-tied my hands and pulled a black bag over my head before gently leading me outside and into a car. 2 hours later, I was back in the room with the body. They had secured me to a metal table that had not been in the room before. Thick leather straps over my thighs, torso, and after removing the hood, forehead. I could only turn my head slightly, but it was enough to see the body and to see that the men had left the room, shutting and locking the door behind them. I called out several times, but got no response. My pleading turned to angry rants, but soon I was tired. my fear overwhelming any sense of indignation. I didn't know what was going on or what was going to happen, and the uncertainty made it much worse. I found myself glancing periodically over at the body from the corner of my eye, but nothing changed. More time passed, and I thrashed against the straps, but they didn't budge. After holding out as long as I could and harboring some insane hope that this would prompt a response, I wet myself. Still nothing. Finally, as I felt my urine cooling against me and my heart starting to slow as I accepted I wasn't getting out of this, I began to cry. Softly at first, and then thick streams of tears ran down the sides of my face and into my hair. That's when the lights went out. It startled me, but it didn't stop me from weeping. Whatever new torture they were going to subject me to, I might as well cry while I could. Eventually I quietened, silent rivulets still coming from my eyes and pooling in my ears. That's when I heard something. It was a small, stealthy sound, a rustle of fabric, then the light scuffing of flesh across the marble floor. I had not fallen asleep, and I knew no one had entered the room unless it was by some silent, secret entrance, as the main doors made too much noise. And the sounds, they were coming from the direction of the body. I remained perfectly still, half frozen from fear now. I listened as I heard the small noises of movement come closer, felt the unmistakable sense of another's presence close to me in the dark. My head immobile, I could tell there was a face floating above me. I heard or felt no breath, but I thought I knew why. I wanted to scream, was opening my mouth to, and that's when I felt the rough, dry tongue on my cheek. The fleshy appendage raked itself carefully, almost thoughtfully, across my cheeks before following the trails of my tears down into my hair and even into the cups of my ears. I held myself perfectly still, as though I was being tasted by some venomous snake and was trying to avoid the subsequent bite. The tongue did its work meticulously, occasionally revisiting my cheeks and the corners of my eyes. Then it was gone. A moment later I felt a light kiss upon my forehead. I heard another slight rustle of movement, and moments later the lights turned back on. The body was back on the dais as though it had never moved. Soon the double doors were opened, and I was escorted back outside to a car, where Jonas was waiting inside. He told the driver to take us back to my house, and while I was so shaken I didn't even want to talk, Jonas wasn't deterred. He apologized for how I had been taken, saying that it was always that way the first time to minimize any resistance. Now that I knew what was what, the next time they would just send a car for me. The next time? I asked. Yes, he said with a sour look. It would take a few times to give back what I had gotten, but by then I'd be ready for another round, he assured. And it would get easier. I asked what the fuck he was talking about. He frowned, looking genuinely perplexed. You always give back what you take out. It's part of the deal. And you'll want to do it again, believe me. It's life-changing. He gave a laugh. Just don't scare me like that again. When you took so long without crying, I was getting worried. I've seen other people not cry, and I've seen what happened to them. She has other ways of taking it back, and believe me, it's not nearly as pleasant. His face looked haunted by the end, and he looked as if he wanted to say more. But in the end, he just turned and looked out the window. I was returned home 10 hours after I had been taken, and since then I've been thinking about what I should do. But I'm writing this not as a cry for help, but as a word of warning. Be careful what thresholds you cross and know yourself before you do, because things have a way of getting paid for, and sometimes you may not like the price. I always said this town was too beautiful to be clean. A place this quaint, with its cobblestone streets and the gentle song of the church bells drifting over the rooftops, couldn't possibly be free of sin. Not really. People like to think their secrets dissolve into the shadows between the pews, or perhaps they're simply too ashamed to look up at the crucifix and admit the truth. I see them, though. I've always seen them. It started with the girl, Ellie Parker. Sweet smile, sweet face, but her eyes betrayed her. Lust flickered in the blue depths, a reflection of the sins she carried like perfume. She came to me once, weeks before it happened, and sat stiffly in the confessional, as if the wood beneath her might burn her for stepping inside. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," she said. Her voice was soft, trembling, but she didn't mean it. She wanted absolution without repentance. That was the problem with all of them. They wanted me to erase their sins, but they never wanted to change. She spoke of a boy, Ryan Cook, how she loved him, how she intended to give herself to him. Love, she called it. But love doesn't leave marks like the ones I'd seen on her neck. It doesn't happen in the dark corners of Lover's Lane. The town mourned her, of course, when her body was found. They wept in the pews, clutching their rosaries as if beads and whispered prayers could undo what had been done. Her hands were folded so perfectly in death, the rosary looped between her fingers. I made sure of it. Ryan, they never found him. They never would. The others came later. Jason Miller and Tyler Novak. They were careful, but not careful enough. The town loved Jason, the golden boy, the star quarterback, the pride of every mother who prayed for her own sons to be just like him. Tyler, though, he was an afterthought. Quiet, strange, always sketching in that little notebook of his. I caught them one evening, lingering too long in the shadows outside the church. Jason kissed Tyler, thinking no one could see. But I did. They too came to me for absolution. Tyler first, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't think it's wrong, Father. It feels like love. He was trembling as he spoke, his eyes wet with guilt. Jason never came to the confessional, though. He was too proud, too assured that his sins could be hidden beneath the shine of his Letterman jacket. When they found the boys at Lover's Lane, the rosaries around their wrists were tight enough to bruise. The police muttered about hate crimes. The townspeople whispered about perversion, and Jason's mother cried so loudly during Mass I thought the walls might crack. I held her hand. I told her God has a plan. Maggie Brown and Henry Carmichael followed not long after. I wasn't planning on them. But temptation always finds its way into the corners of our lives, doesn't it? Maggie was a girl with a past. No family, no steady job, no dignity. She came to the church once, asked for money, asked for forgiveness, asked for everything except what mattered most. And Henry, the good married politician, a man of power but not of restraint. They were together at Lover's Lane when I found them. His hand on her knee, her laughter soft and bitter. The lipstick in her purse was the perfect shade of red for a warning. Sinners die, it said. A truth written plainly for the world to see. The town began to panic then. Whispers turned to rumors, turned to a frenzy of prayer and suspicion. They locked their doors at night, crossed themselves every time they passed the church, and looked at one another with narrowed eyes. But it was not them they should have feared. It never was. Adrian Cross came next, the detective from Boston. He was an outsider, gruff, sharp-eyed, always asking questions. He came to the church often, claiming it was for the investigation, but I saw the way he looked at Claire Montgomery, a married woman, a teacher at the Catholic school. She came to me, too. Not in the confessional, but in the quiet of the rectory. She told me she felt trapped, that her husband didn't love her, that Adrian made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. I told her the truth. Life is not about feeling alive. It is about being righteous. She didn't come back after that. Claire's body was the hardest to arrange. There was something sacred in her despite her flaws, and it pained me more than I care to admit. But the sin had to be cleansed. Adrian would pay for his role too, if not in death, then in disgrace. The town turned on him like wolves, their whispers swelling to roars. I spoke softly in my sermons, guiding them like a shepherd. Trust in God's judgment, I said. He will reveal the truth. And he did. The catacombs beneath the church are quiet now. Ryan is here. His motorcycle rusted and broken beside him, the paint flaking like old skin. Claire is here too, and the others, though I suspect they no longer know their names. I sit among them, sharpening my knife, the blade catching the faint glow of candlelight. It is a comforting sound, a steady rhythm, a prayer in its own way. They will come again, the sinners. They always do, and I will be here, waiting. The wages of sin is death. I have always been his instrument. I doubt anyone is going to believe me, but I don't care. I recently just opened a convenience store I have spent over a year trying to open. Since we just opened, and I only have one part-time employee right now, I pretty much work 7 nights a week. I have to take the last train every night at around 1 a.m. to get home. With this being so routine, I start to see the same people on the train every night. One man in particular I have seen every night for the last 2 weeks. He's a middle-aged man with a beer belly and always wears the same Dodgers baseball cap. These last few nights, something has changed. It started last Saturday. He came on the train and sat on the other side of the train car as normal, and I know this sounds stupid, but I swear he was a few inches taller. Not terribly noticeable, but I swear on my wife's grave his head usually goes to just below the handlebars on the ceiling, but that night his head was the same height as the handlebars. At first I just shrugged it off. Maybe he was slouching before, or I just was misremembering. Monday night was when I knew something was wrong. He was at least a foot taller. He now had to duck under the handlebars just to sit down. I wish I had pictures of before and after so you knew I wasn't seeing things. I don't know how he's doing it, but he's getting taller. Day by day, night by night, inch by inch. The mere thought of this impossible scenario had been eating away at my mind like a termite. I didn't see him Tuesday night, but when I was taking my kids to the park that morning, I could have sworn I saw him at the park, so tall he towered over the swing set. He had to be over 2 feet taller at that point. I tried telling my part-time employee that night, but he looked at me like I was telling him I saw an alien. I don't even blame him. Your boss you just met starts ranting to you about how a man getting taller on the train. Why would you believe him? What if it's just a different guy? He says, as if I hadn't considered that at all. On Wednesday, I spent my entire day looking up ways people could become taller. All I found were bizarre stretches and extremely sketchy surgeries, and even then, the most they could give you was a foot. And when he got on the train that night, he had to duck his head so it didn't hit the roof of the car. He had to be at least 3 feet taller now. For the next few nights, he didn't get much taller, but he did get lankier. His arms became stretched to the point of almost touching his ankles. His neck became horribly outstretched to the point of being disgusting to just look at, with the bumps of his spinal cord showing through his skin like a hairless, starved dog. His hair became longer as well, his Dodgers cap barely able to contain the mess of long black strands loosely falling off either side of his crazed face. The worst part, however, every night, despite how monstrous he looked, he would walk on the car, sit in his same spot and patiently wait for his stop, before calmly walking off. I can't focus. How am I supposed to even rationalize this in my mind? My mom thinks I am just distraught over my wife's death, but how am I supposed to explain what is really happening? I won't go into detail about every day, but trust me, he changed every single night. Sometimes noticeably, like gaining a few inches in height, sometimes he barely changed at all, but every time something was a little bit different. All the time I spend at the store, I'm distracted. I have gone on to different train cars and he still gets on. I've even switched cars after he gets on and he's on the other cars as well. He's in every car at the same time. I tried to explain this to my mom when she came to pick up my kids. She is worried about me. No one believes me. I don't even know if I believe me. This man has entered my life and poked and prodded at my sanity until I feel my grip on reality slipping like a bar of soap through my fingers. What's stopping him from approaching me? Attacking me? Why does he just sit there? I've started a nervous shaking that stays with me all day. The thought of what the man will look like tonight stays in the back of my mind like an itch I could never scratch. Last night he walked in, bones cracking like thin ice with every step. His skin so tightly pressed against his bones, you could every ligament on every visible joint. The only clothing he now had was a pair of ripped-up track pants and his Dodgers hat. After seeing how monstrous he became and his complete lack of any sort of reaction to my presence once again, I decided to do something I had never done before. I decided to sit in a different seat. I usually stay near the back of the train car because he usually sits at the front. Just 3 stops away from where he usually gets off, I decided I was going to sit in the seat that is right in front of him. After taking 3 deep breaths and leaving any worry behind, I got up and made my way to the empty seat across from him. As I sat down, he didn't even register my existence. I had never seen him at this angle before. Getting a better look only served to fill me with heart-pounding fear and regret. His eyes were sticking out from the sides of his head, his pupils milky white like a blind old dog. What used to be his nose now extended outward like a deer's snout. His teeth were sharp as bear teeth and were always snarled like a threatened lion protecting their young. I sat there just staring deep into its eyes. I'm not a religious man, but looking at this haunted figure in front of me, I knew in my heart I was staring at some unholy creation that crawled from the depths of hell just to torment me with its uncanny presence. As we left the last stop before the creature's usual destination, it finally spoke. Sandy, Luke, Jonathan, Christine, Mark, Liam, Melissa, Alexander. It was saying my family's names. From my late wife and children to my mother and cousins I haven't seen in years. Unmoving, unflinching, and without so much as a twitch in the ice of its eyes, it listed name after name. My grandparents, my brother, my nieces, nephews. When it ran out of family, it even began saying the names of friends from college and old high school crushes I had. I felt my fists curl into a ball on my knees as I sat there and listened to this alien creature list off everyone I could ever hold dear to me. Until finally it was its stop. Like every night before, it got up calmly without saying another word and walked off the train into the black void of the night. Whatever I had left of my mind was broken into pieces. This needed to end one way or another. When this first started noticing these changes, I immediately tried to hire on more help at the store so I didn't have to take the train anymore. I even interviewed a few candidates. Some of them were very good for the position, but every time I went to call them to tell them they got the job, something came over me and I told them they didn't make the cut. As if someone was pupating my words, I would open my mouth to say you got the job, and by the time I closed it again, the call was over, and they weren't hired. I can't do this. After last night, this cannot continue. With my kids staying with my mom now, no one questioned me getting a Glock G19. I hate guns, they terrify me, but the thing at the other end of the train car terrifies me even more. I spent my entire shift today looking at the gun in my desk drawer, preparing in my mind as to what I was even planning on doing. Getting on the train, I still had no idea. When the creature stepped back on it, looked the same as yesterday. The first time in days it hadn't made a noticeable difference. At the next stop, before I could even think of a plan of action, I got up, ran up beside it, pointing the barrel at its impossibly deformed skull, and fired. The creature made no noise as it slumped to the side, its nightmare-inducing body falling limp on the seats beside it. For a split second, I know I saw the figure turn back into the man it once was, just for a fraction of a second. I bolted out off the train. As I ran down the station, I caught a glimpse of the other cars as I ran. There were hundreds of the creatures in each car, motionlessly staring directly at me as I ran. I write this on the bridge just 3 miles away from the train station. I write this not as a justification, but rather an explanation and one last chance to say I love you. I love you, Sandy. I love you, Luke. And I love you, Jonathan. I love you, Mom and Dad. Everyone who will demand an explanation, I hope this provides you some clarity. I'm sorry the hurt I have caused. I hope I have defeated the man on the train, and God can look me with grace as I did all I could to defeat this embodiment of hell that crept into my life. But one thing I know for certain: if he doesn't hear my prayers tonight, that won't be the last I see of the man on the train. Growing up, I attended what I thought was a charismatic church that, in hindsight, I realized was an apocalyptic cult. They had a lot of strange rituals and customs, but none more important than speaking in tongues. The church believed that if one prayed and begged hard enough, and if they were worthy, they would be able to speak in the language of heaven, and by doing so, it would be a sign of a divine presence residing inside of you. And that once you had this gift, you would be raptured and spared from the coming apocalypse on earth and the eternal torment of the afterlife. If you hadn't yet spoken in tongues, you wouldn't go to heaven when the rapture, the moment when the saved ascended to heaven, occurred. You'd be left on earth to experience the apocalypse, and when you died, you'd burn in hell for eternity. That's a lot for a kid to process. The way to get this gift of the Spirit was to go up to the front of the church during the altar call, which happened toward the end of every service, right after the collection plate was passed. The congregation, traumatized by the pastor's frequent and vivid descriptions of the eternal torment awaiting the unsaved, would gather around the altar, praying for the gift of tongues for themselves or members of the church who hadn't yet received it. Those who didn't have it were instructed to pray, praise God, and beg for the gift. We'd do this regularly, desperately, and the altar calls could last for hours. Imagine it. Children and adults all crowded around the red-carpeted steps of the altar, screaming, spraying saliva, sobbing, praying, sweating, and placing their hands on each other, all pleading for this gift, genuinely expecting the rapture to happen at any moment. Honestly, I spent most of my childhood and early teens trying to receive this elusive gift. I spent countless hours at the altar begging and pleading with God to grant me the one thing that would save me from hell. Night after night, surrounded by screaming adults, I begged God until my voice was raw. To add insult to injury, it seemed like at every altar call, someone around me received the gift. To my left or to my right, someone would begin babbling incoherently, collapse to the ground, and then be helped up to their feet by a celebrating congregation. But despite all my efforts and sincerity, each night it was denied to me. Eventually, the crowd around the altar would disperse. Late at night, often around midnight, the service would finally end, and we'd go home. I'd spend the drive back staring out the car window at the night sky, my clothes damp with sweat, and my throat sore from pleading with a God who refused to answer. Growing up, the fear of hell, the apocalypse, and eternal damnation was a real force in my life. I can remember times when my mom came home late from work, and I was convinced she'd been raptured, leaving me behind. I'd hide in my closet, clutching some sort of improvised weapon, a broom, a steak knife, etc., certain that the damned would soon kick in the front door. For what purpose? Maybe to eat me or sacrifice me to Satan. I wasn't sure what the damned did, but I knew it couldn't be good. All this made for an interesting, high-anxiety and, at times, sleep-deprived childhood. When I was around 16, the pastor started preaching that the rapture was particularly imminent. We began having service every night about the coming apocalypse and the importance of speaking in tongues for the unsaved. The pastor warned that hell would be infinitely worse for people like me who knew the truth but hadn't accepted the gift. This was especially frustrating for me. I was trying so hard. After the collection plate was passed, we had the inevitable altar call, and at each of them I tried harder and harder to speak in tongues, but it still wasn't happening. I started to think maybe I was immune or something. Finally, after an especially long altar call, the pastor took me aside and told me, in a voice filled with compassion, concern, and perhaps a hint of exasperation, that if I just repeated the word hallelujah over and over again, God could use it as a foothold to enter my heart and grant me the gift. At the next altar call, I gave it a try. I knelt at the altar shouting hallelujah over and over again. I was helped by an older man in the church who often mentored and prayed with the young boys, either one-on-one at his house, which he preferred, or at the altar. He considered this his calling. This oddly overly affectionate man, a self-proclaimed prayer warrior, whispered words of encouragement in my ear as he knelt behind me, rubbing his hands tenderly across my sweating back and shoulders. Hallelujah, I shouted again and again. My arms waved, my body swayed, and my knees ached. My throat was raw and my voice was fading. The words began to run together, syllables dropping and merging. This only excited the people around me, especially the man behind me. Hallelujah, hallelujah. I kept shouting, faster and faster. Exhausted, the words blurred into nonsense. Around me, the church members screamed and prayed with ecstatic fervor. The pastor, now kneeling in front of me, tangled her fingers in my hair with one hand, grabbed my chin with the other, and brought her fleshy face close to mine, pressing her puckered lips against my ear. "No, say it like this," she whispered, her breath hot, moist, and intrusive, and then she began repeating the word hallelujah, improvising like a jazz musician, creating her own excited babble of syllables to accompany mine. Behind me, the man prayed harder, his breath hot on my neck, his body pressed close to mine. His hands moved roughly over my shoulders and back. He whispered in my ear, urging me to pray harder, harder to let it inside me. Hallelujah, hallelujah. I tried to keep shouting, but my voice faltered, my words turning to mush. The crowd erupted in a frenzy of excitement. The word blurred, lost its meaning, became a nonsensical noise. My throat burned, my body trembled. The pastor kept whispering in my ear, but her voice seemed to change. The word she kept repeating was now unrecognizable. The first syllable a percussive exhalation, the second a wheezing gasp, the third obscenely stretched out, the last almost a cry of pain. Her wet lips squirmed against my ear like worms. I felt her tongue in my ear, her voice in my head, and suddenly something shifted. The air grew thick and cold. The sounds around me suddenly muffled and distant. I felt like I was submerged in dark water. A strange presence loomed all around me. No, inside me, a watching, waiting something. I felt a million miles away, and a coldness crept into my chest. An internal ocean of black water teeming with something dark and squirming, rising up my throat and bursting out of my mouth. It hurt. I started screaming. We all seemed to be screaming in unison, and the lights were flickering, and suddenly I was being helped to my feet. I had apparently blacked out, collapsing face forward onto the steps of the altar. It wasn't an unusual occurrence at the church. They called it being slain by the Spirit. I had rug burns on my forehead for weeks. Still, as I came to, all around me, everyone was ecstatic. "You've got it," someone shouted, their hands gripping my arms and shoulders. Everyone was happy. I was being congratulated, showered with love, and in the middle of it all, someone, I don't know who, whispered in my ear, "It's inside you now." And I felt a strange chill. I knew I should be happy. I tried to convince myself I was, but I felt different. Hollowed out. Violated in a way I couldn't quite grasp or articulate. Later, before the service ended, the pastor asked me to come up to the pulpit to make an announcement. Numb, exhausted, and uncertain, I walked up. As I neared the pulpit, I glanced at the pastor. Our eyes met, and I still remember her expression. Though she smiled, her face seemed smug and sly, as though the two of us were co-conspirators. She nodded toward the pulpit, silently encouraging me to play along. I stepped up and looked out at the congregation, the only friends and community I had ever known. Their upturned faces were expectant, like children waiting for a story. I made my choice. "I spoke in tongues," I said into the microphone. My voice was raw and my throat was sore, but the declaration boomed around the church with a confidence I didn't feel. The congregation erupted in applause and shouts of "Amen" and "Praise the Lord." Their words blended into an indecipherable babble that sounded like tongues. Hallelujah. But I wasn't exactly sure what it was that I'd done. I wasn't sure what I'd let in. That night I couldn't sleep. My room felt suffocating, the air thick with something unseen, some new and terrible thing inside of me and around me. I lay awake replaying the altar scene in my mind. The man's hands, the pastor's smile, the cold presence that had seemingly entered me, the feeling of something inside of me boiling over, the pain, and the beginning of a scream. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint and guttural from my own mouth, but it wasn't me speaking. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't English or the word hallelujah. It was something older, darker, like the sound of something massive choking up something vile, but I could understand it. "Not now," it said from my own mouth. "Not now, but soon." I froze, my body paralyzed as the words seemed to echo in the room and my mind. And then, just as suddenly, the voice, the feeling, was gone. I refused to go back to the church after that. Rejecting the faith of my family at such a young age tore my life apart, but I survived. I grew up, and over the following decades I found peace, love, and my place in the wider world. Or I thought I had. But last night, as I was washing dishes, I started to gag, cough, and gasp for air, and I felt it again, rising up, the voice that wasn't a voice, the words that weren't words in any human language. They burned and tore at my chest and throat and spilled out into the empty air around me. "Really soon now," it said through me, with undisguised glee. The plate shattered in my hand, cutting deep into my palm. Cold dread rushed through me and then somehow beyond me, standing at my sink in my empty house, with blood welling up in my cupped palm. I realized I wasn't alone with the voice or the pain. Not really. I could feel them. The connection snapped into place, somehow simultaneously stabbing and tearing at me. A pain sharp, dull, and overwhelming, like a clawed finger pushing into the center of my mind, slicing, stretching, and flipping a switch. I knew all of them, the others, the ones who'd been there at the church when I was a boy. Their thoughts, their faces, their secrets, loves, and fears flooded my mind. They were scattered across the world. Most had moved on, healed, and built new lives just like me, but I knew at that moment, we all knew, that we were still marked and connected by the same terrible fate and bond. The voice was in them too, rising up, burning, tearing at us all. I could feel their fear, confusion, pain, mirroring my own, and a growing understanding of what was coming. A terrible, all-consuming compulsion building inside me, in all of us. Pressing, urgent, and impossible to resist any longer. For death, destruction, chaos, glorious purpose, and hell on earth. The voice was rising up again, preparing to speak. In agony, I clawed at my face and throat, tearing at my collar in desperation, unintentionally smearing blood from my cut hand across my face, mouth, and neck. Blood, red, hot, salty, and so beautiful. On its own, my tongue lashed out, impossibly long, flailing wildly at the air, lapping at the blood around my mouth and in my palm. It was unexpectedly delicious, sparking an explosion of pleasure in my injured hand, groin, chest, and head. A pleasure somehow shared with all the others, rapturous in its mounting intensity, heavenly. "It's almost time," we all choked and gagged out in gleeful unison and hellish chorus, followed by horrible wet sounds that burned in our chests, tore at our throats, and burst out of our mouths. Inhuman, monstrous, utterly insane sounds that we all recognized as laughter. I don't have many childhood memories of my father, but I'll never forget the time he took me to a rodeo. I was about 8 years old, wide-eyed and overwhelmed, as if we'd stepped into another world. Cowboys on horseback, bulls snorting in their pens, clowns doing cartwheels, and the air filled with the sound of cheering crowds. It was chaos, adventure, and magic, all rolled into one. The smells, though, were something else entirely. The sharp tang of manure, sweat, and beer mingled with the sweetness of fried food. It all made my head spin. I had my first funnel cake that day. That's another thing I'll never forget. The powdered sugar dusting my hands and face like snow. It was delicious, for about 10 minutes. Then came the stomach cramps. That's how I ended up in one of the rodeo's porta potties. It was as disgusting as you'd imagine, maybe worse. The air inside was humid and foul, a combination of chemical sanitizer and things far less sanitary. And then there was me explosively adding to the mix. Once, twice, 3 times. I tried to be quick. Honestly, I didn't have much choice in the matter, but when I reached for toilet paper, I froze. There wasn't any. Panic set in fast. "Dad," I yelled, my voice muffled by the plastic walls. To his credit, my dad acted quickly. Without hesitation, he slid the only paper he had on hand through a crack in the door. It was a crisp and clean $5 bill. At first, I just stared at it. $5 whole? My 8-year-old brain whirred with possibilities. A G.I. Joe action figure, so much candy, multiple comic books. A kid could buy a lot with that kind of money. But then reality set in and I sighed. $5 or no, I had no choice. I've never appreciated, or depreciated, a $5 bill more. Figuratively, it was too much. Literally, it wasn't enough. Ultimately, I made it suffice. The humiliation of using it was one thing, but the mingled disgust, relief, and regret of letting it slip into the dark abyss below, that's something else entirely. And then I heard it. A sound rising from the depths of the porta potty, bubbling, gurgling like something thick and wet stirring far beneath me. I froze, my stomach a tight ball. It's just the normal, gross noises of a place like this, I told myself. But then the sound shifted. "Thank you," burbled from below me. The voice was faint but unmistakable. A wet and gelatinous sound that sent a jolt up my spine and made my hair feel like it was standing up. Every nerve in my 8-year-old body was screaming at me to run, but I literally couldn't move. "Thank you," the voice said again, clearer and closer this time. I felt a faint puff of air against my bare bottom with each word. My legs finally obeyed, and I launched myself up from the seat. My pants and Superman underoos tangled around my ankles. My knees wobbled, and my body contorted as I tried to simultaneously stand, pull up my pants, and stagger away, all while still keeping my eyes fixed on the opening behind me. Then I saw it. Something sloshing upward, bubbling up over the rim. Hands. Dozens of pairs of hands. No, not hands exactly. They were too many, too long and too thin, the fingers writhing like worms tipped with splintered nails. They clawed their way out of the darkness, one after another, attached to bone-thin wrists, elbows, second set of elbows, all bent at impossible angles, folding and unfolding like a grotesque flesh tree. Each smeared limb was draped with loops and clumps of wet-stained, dissolving toilet paper, like a horrible kaleidoscopic mummy doing an interpretive hand dance. One of the hands held the damp, curling, and now stained $5 bill up to my face. I could smell it and see Lincoln's face, remarkably impartial, considering the circumstances, smeared slightly and quivering before my terrified eyes. The hand pinched the bill delicately between a thumb and forefinger, the other fingers splayed out, like a disgusting parody of the OK symbol. "More?" The voice gurgled, louder now. Closer, its tone inquiring. I screamed piercingly, yanking up my pants so hard that I hurt myself a little, and slammed my body against the porta potty door. My shaking hands pawed the latch, baffled by it. Behind me I could hear hands, so many hands, squeaking, sliding, scratching and scrabbling at the walls. The plastic walls around me groaned under the weight of something impossibly large, growing, spreading, pushing. Finally the latch gave way. I sprawled in the dirt, tears streaming down my face, the sunlight blinding. My father was there instantly, pulling me up, his voice sharp and panicked. "What happened? Are you okay? Stop messing around." I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. I pointed mutely and desperately at the porta potty. Behind him, the porta-potty door hung open, silent and empty, its seat gaping open like a mouth forming a black O of surprise. It's been 40 years since that day. I've told myself and therapists 100 different versions of what happened. I've convinced myself it was a hallucination, a fever dream brought on by bad funnel cake and a child's overactive imagination. But deep down, I know I saw something impossible, something horrible. It changed me. After the rodeo, I couldn't use a public bathroom again. At first, my parents chalked it up to typical childhood quirks, but as I got older, it became a problem. Road trips were impossible. Overnight stays at friends' houses were out of the question. College was a nightmare. I spent years avoiding the topic, pretending it wasn't a problem, but the truth is, I'm terrified of what I might hear or see if I let my pants and guard down. So when I bought my house last year, the first thing I noticed was the bathrooms. 3 of them, all white, all private, all mine. It felt like a sign, like maybe I'd finally found a place where I could feel safe. But houses, like people, have their quirks. The plumbing was the first thing to act up. Pipes knocking in the walls, toilets refusing to flush, a faint smell of sewage that lingered in the basement no matter how much I cleaned. The home inspector told me it was nothing to worry about. Old house, old pipes, he said, but it got worse. 3 months ago, the sewer line backed up completely. The plumber came out, ran a camera down the line, and said I needed a complete replacement. $12,500 later, the problem seemed fixed. At least I thought it was. It happened this morning. I had just flushed the toilet in the upstairs bathroom. The water swirled down, and for a moment, everything seemed fine. But as I switched off the light and closed the bathroom door behind me, I heard it. "Thank you," drifted up from the rattling pipes, faint but unmistakable. I froze, my hand still gripping the bathroom door handle. The words were wet, gurgling, bubbling up, exactly as I remembered. Through the door, I could smell sewage and hear what sounded like water hitting the floor. "More?" The voice gurgled wetly, much clearer now. I held onto the door handle, knuckles white, as though it were the only thing keeping me upright. Behind the door, I heard what sounded like wet hands pawing, sliding, and scratching at the tile, getting louder, vibrating the wall, and the voice, loud, insistent, demanding more. Music is and has been my life. It's been my escape. It's been there for me through my pains, sorrows, victories, and so much more. Listening to music and making music, a new hobby of mine, is a huge creative outlet for me. It's fun and occupies my thoughts. The lyrics I write and then turn into a song. That's my way of feeling, that's my way of coping. And it may not be healthy, but my mental health isn't what I'm writing this about right now. And I don't have enough time to delve into that stuff. While scrolling through my music app looking for new mixes and shit, I came across a new playlist or compilation. My most listened to of 2024. It being the new year, I was and had been curious. The top songs weren't surprising to me, being my own personal favorites along with songs that calmed me, or songs I screamed my lungs out to. But at the bottom, hiding inconspicuously between other tracks, was one song I can't recall ever listening to. Its name was I'm Here, and the artist name was blank. I'm not even kidding. The band or artist or whoever produced this song called themselves blank. Pretty weird, right? Well, it didn't stop there. At first I thought this was some unknown singer who somehow hacked themselves into my most listened to boost their song or something. I too was dubious about this. Stupid way of thinking and all, but I was still curious. I went to the artist's bio expecting nothing. The bio was empty, but something caught my attention and brought chills all down my spine. This mystery person, whoever they were, had a profile picture. And it wasn't normal, as it was legitimately my house. At this point, I was freaking out. Confused and scared, I screenshotted it and went to my gallery, only for my whole phone to crash and shut down. It must have died. I charged it immediately, and the moment it turned back on, I checked the artist again, but the search couldn't find it. Trying to calm myself, I convinced myself it was a glitch. I went through my most listened to, but I didn't find it. It was nowhere to be found, so naturally I took to the internet. No information. It was pretty late, so I assumed hesitantly that I'd made it up due to lack of sleep or anxiety, which I had a lot of. Feeling a bit restless, I decided to turn on my headphones and soothe myself with the familiar and calming videos I listen to often. My favorite YouTubers screaming over horror games. It was a bad idea since, this creepy-ass shit happened to me. I did it anyway, and was almost about to fall asleep until a stupid ad burst through my headphone speakers, startling me into awareness. Annoyed, I turned over and grabbed my phone, getting ready to skip the ad until... Do you feel like you're being watched? Feel unsafe in your own home? A cliched, enthusiastic man said through my headphones. Typical ad, promising and guaranteeing pointless shit. I was getting really tired, so decided to close the app and turn my phone off. After closing YouTube, the voice was still loudly going in my ears. What the heck, this was getting more annoying than it was weird. I listened anyway because, I was curious. I wish I hadn't been. Well, if you are, we have the perfect product for you. It'll watch or observe and protect you through your sleep. Just don't tell the government. Did this thing know I'd been trying to sleep? What the hell? Don't be scared now. This is Project Blank, and we're here for you. Wait, that sounded a bit familiar. Project Blank, like that blank, the mysterious artist? And the song called I'm Here? Speaking of, that suddenly reminded me then to check my screenshots. Surely the screen cap I'd gotten would be there. I wasn't crazy, but, as you've probably already guessed, there was nothing there. Except for something in my camera roll. With the ad still going off in the background, I locked in, focusing on the photo. I didn't remember taking any photos recently, so I tapped on the photo. It was just a black background, with what seemed to be a link in the center. Small, but still readable. But whatever the hell was going on, was anyone really dumb enough to go to a shady-ass link? I certainly wasn't. Just to be safe, I ignored the ad and shut down my phone. Sighing, I fell asleep easily afterwards, and besides a bad dream or two, which is quite normal for me, I slept fairly well, especially considering what had happened last night. I put that in quotes because I'm probably just crazy and hallucinating. When I awoke, I got dressed, brushed my teeth, and did my morning routine. I'd completely forgotten about the events of last night, grabbing my headphones and turning on my favorite playlist while doing chores around the house. After a while, an unfamiliar song started playing. Weird. Maybe I'd reached the end of the playlist and it was playing recommended tracks. I let it play as the beginning was interesting. It sounded like footsteps accompanied by a light guitar, plucking off beat with a slight fuzzy sound. The song was like this for a few more seconds before it changed. The footsteps became louder, so loud I could have sworn they were right behind me. Then, the sound of a doorknob turning in the song, if that's what you could even call it, creeped me out, so I closed it. Then I heard a knock. Oh, hell no. Number nope. I turned my headphones off, holding my phone close to my chest. Then the music started playing again, in sync with an unfamiliar voice behind the door. I'm here. I'm writing this while hiding in my closet. I've dialed 911 and explained that there was an intruder. But the music is getting louder and louder. I hate this music. I swear the noise will give away my hiding spot, considering Blank can or hasn't already. Come inside of my house. The lyrics of the song have been eerie. They keep saying, listen to the music. It sounds like a fucking cult, so to whomever is reading this, please be wary. You never know when music can turn on you. There's an evolutionary term called carcinization. It's the process in which crustaceans evolve in such a way to eventually take the shape of a crab. Some people, particularly those who only found out about the phenomena through Reddit posts or word of mouth, take this to mean that the evolutionary path of all creatures eventually leads to becoming a crab. As someone who is studying to become a marine biologist, I used to roll my eyes and correct people on the matter, which is a phenomena that was exclusively to crustaceans, and that they weren't becoming crabs but merely taking a shape more similar to a crab's body. That's how it was supposed to work, at least. I was shocked to discover that I was the one in the wrong all along. I first observed the changes in late April. My neighbor, a somewhat portly young man named Jason, had begun to rapidly bald and shrink in size and posture despite his age. It was as if he was becoming an elderly man suddenly and uncontrollably at the age of 24. Though I initially didn't think it was much more than an unfortunate case of biology or disease, the scientific part of me couldn't help but find some strange fascination in Jason's sudden deterioration. This fascination made it impossible for me not to study Jason's deformities and keep a quiet tally of the severity of the changes each time I saw him. This wasn't difficult, as Jason would soon come to see me on a sometimes even tri-weekly basis. I had begun to suspect that Jason, who by May had been completely bald and shrunken from 6'1" to 5'6" with a noticeable hunch in his back, had suddenly begun to lack in female attention. He had begun to rely more and more on my curiosity for companionship, which I didn't mind. It was a fine transactional relationship for me, wherein Jason got to have a little friendly attention a few times a week while I studied the increasingly rapid change to his physicality. By July, my mental tallies of Jason's condition became handwritten notes and entire page sketches in my journal. Fascinatingly, Jason was not just shrinking and losing his upright posture, but appeared to be flattening out, with his neck receding in such a way that his head appeared to be fused with his spine, which now was a nearly perfect acute angle with his pelvis. His skin was becoming coarse and rough, his fingers appeared to be fusing together, and his eyes were ever so slightly bulging out of his head. I was completely and utterly enthralled with Jason's condition, and I started to fall behind on coursework in my self-study of what was going on. He had the symptoms of many different diseases, but no one in particular, and none that made sense given his age and presumably good health prior to his transformation. Transformation really was the best word to describe it, because Jason no longer looked like Jason, 24-year-old suburban-dwelling man, but had started to look more like a crab. That's when it hit me. What if somehow Jason was undergoing carcinization? Rather, some sort of new, unheard-of hypercarcinization? The thought was ridiculous and impossible given what we know about biology, but I couldn't get it out of my mind. Something primordial in my head saw Jason and recognized the crab he was becoming, like an evolutionary fear response designed to protect us from predators. It was a deep sense that couldn't be argued with, no matter how intelligent and rational I was, and no matter what the laws of science said could be possible. But science is not a static thing, as new discoveries every day change our understanding of life and the universe. Though I should rationally be afraid of what was happening to Jason, instead he became my discovery, my new thesis that would rocket me to the stop of the scientific world. I would study Jason and not allow anything to impede on his transformation, and present my findings to a world in awe of a new understanding of evolution. So when I discovered Jason was going to be moving out, away from his home to be taken care of by family and specialist doctors, I knew something had to be done. It wasn't hard to get Jason over to my place. He most definitely confused my interest in his condition and our frequent interactions as affection, and the poor lonely man wouldn't leave without at least one more visit with his neighbor. I asked if he wanted a drink, and as he stepped into my kitchen, I couldn't help but stare in awe at what the light caught on Jason's skin. Out of Jason's skin protruded bone, layering thin across the lengths of his arms and at his shoulder blades. I ran my hands over it and Jason whimpered, clearly sensitive to the touch, but too afraid to say anything about it. What I felt was a rough, rocky texture, bumpy in spots and serrated at the edges. Jason was growing chitin. He was producing a shell in a process that seemed to be almost like a crab shedding. Only the old shell Jason was shedding was everything that made him human. I knew then and there that I was right about his transformation and the importance of my discovery. I was also correct about the mixture of Ambien and red wine and the effect it would have on Jason's consciousness. I locked my discovery in the basement, secure from the doctors who would try to steal the credit of my findings. It didn't take much. Jason, through his transformation, was becoming physically weak. By the time he came over to my home, he was struggling to bear the weight of his own shoulders. A simple deadbolt and a chain for safe measure were enough to keep him down there. I would bring him meals and water once a day and document any noticeable changes made. If Jason ever tried to overpower me or make a run for it, the sound of my taser sparking would change his mind quickly. His family came looking for him, knocking on my door, asking if I'd seen him and giving me posters to pass out and a number to call. Jason's sister was especially determined in her search, visiting me more than once with an accusatory tone each time. I was smart enough not to let her in. While you couldn't hear it from the porch, stepping far enough into my home would subject you to Jason's weak, pained whimpers and strained cries for help. They were almost nonstop, broken up only by the rare and short-lived moments he got to sleep. It was enough to make me pity him. Jason was a person before he became my discovery, and listening to the wailing pains of his necessary transformation from person to scientific marvel were enough to make me second-guess my work at times. I began checking on him less and less. I couldn't stand his pathetic begging to be set free each time I came down to study his changes, which were becoming more rapid by the day. One day, the mewling and whining stopped. I was certain that Jason had met some kind of untimely demise in the confines of my basement. Guilt washed over me as I climbed down the aged staircase leading into my experiment's den. It was dark, the light bulb long since burning out, and worse than that, it was quiet. It smelled damp, like a pipe had burst or something was leaking from the bowed wood ceiling into the uneven concrete floor. As I came to the bottom of the staircase, I was stunned into stillness by fear of what was waiting for me in that dark. I couldn't tell what was worse at this point, the idea that Jason could be dead, his half-mutated, mangled body rotting in the basement in front of me, or that he was still alive. Would I rather meet the corpse or the man? I had my question answered as I stepped foot on the concrete floor, and something in the darkness lashed out at me. I backed up quickly as what could only be described as a massive claw, made from fingers stretched and elongated out of their sockets, and fused together by bone chitons snapped at the air where my leg had just been. The sound was horrible, a loud clack like two sticks smacked together, followed by a creaking and fleshy tearing as the mutant claw struggled to open back up. Frantically, I scooted back up the stairs, clinging to the handrail as I ran backwards, my eyes glued on what was emerging from the darkness below me. What was once Jason's head came from out of the darkness, fused into his shoulder blades, which now protruded out to cover what would have been his ears. One eye was larger than the other, swollen and protruding and black, creating a mortifying contrast with the human eye that remained, red from the tears that fell down his cheek. There was a slit separating the middle of his chin, making it hard for Jason to speak as his jaw seemed to slack and fall in separate directions when he tried. It did not stop him from trying. Please, hungry, hurt. I remember him whimpering, begging, a tone that sounded half like he needed my help and half like he was angry, like he'd snap my neck with that great big claw if he had the chance. I could hear more of that anger reflected as he spoke again, sucking in the spit that dribbled from his split jaw and shouting, "Please!" My weight was shifted onto the handrail as I started in frozen awe at the terror before me. The weight caused the old wood to bend and snap, catting my hand and sending me falling nearly to the bottom of the stairs. At the sound of my scream, or maybe the smell of my blood, Jason rushed for me, dragging himself forward with a terrible bony apparatus that must have once been an arm or a leg, snapping at me with his massive claw as he dragged the terrible weight of his broken body up the stairs. I scampered back to the door, and while I was able to clear the distance before he was able to catch me, he got close. I could feel in my bones what Jason would do to me if he caught me. I stared back down at him, peering up at me from the darkness, crying with his one human eye as the black bulging bead on his right side seemed to stare at me. I shut the door and locked the locks. I never checked the basement again. Weeks went by. There was never the sound of whimpering or begging from the basement again, and I was determined to allow my mistake to die in the dark, where I didn't have to think about it ever again. Despite my wishes, the occasional banging against the door let me know Jason was still alive, smashing his claw against the wood and rattling the locks. This would only stop when I would open the chain door far enough to pass food through the gap. I would shut it quickly, pressing my back to the door each time in case Jason decided to finally break through the wood and attack me. He never did. Jason's sister kept coming back, kept threatening to call the police if I was keeping anything secret from her. The obvious gash on my hand and the dead look in my eyes were obviously making her suspicious. She'd come to my door and rant about how she knew something was up, that she was going to prove it, that if her brother was hurt or worse, she'd kill me. I'd just stare at her and think about how tired I was, and how much I wish I could just give Jason back and forget any of this ever happened. Then, one day while she was on my porch, he started banging on the basement door. Startled, she pushed past me and ran to the basement. I was frozen for a moment as the shock of what happened kept me from fully processing what was going on. I thought about being caught, spending the rest of my life in prison for kidnapping or worse. Would I be blamed for the deterioration of Jason's condition? Would my scientific approach to the situation have any bearing in court whatsoever? Did I actually want to get caught so this nightmare would finally be over? When I saw her going for the door, I thought about Jason getting out. That thought scared me enough to spring into action. I rushed between her and the door. She screamed at me, shouted that she knew she was right, and pummeled my chest with her fists. The claw on the other side of the door banged harder, the pressure smashing into my back worse than anything she threw at me. She grabbed me by the shoulders and threw me to back away from the door. I lunged for her wrist, grabbing and pulling her back, begging her not to open that door. She didn't listen, shooting me a look filled with tears and anger. When she finally unlocked the door and threw it open, she glanced back towards the basement. I don't know what look she had then, but I can imagine it. The terror at least would have been brief. I watched as that giant claw lunged from out of the darkness and grabbed her leg. I saw her ankle twist in the brief moment before she hit the floor, her head bouncing off the wood with a fleshy thud, the fall taking me with her. I watched her twist and squirm, turning to face me. She dug her nails into the wood and screamed for help as she was dragged down the staircase, one long tug after the other bringing her further down until everything below her shoulders was swallowed by the dark below. I saw that final horrible look on her face, tears streaking down her red cheeks, her eyes so wide they looked like they might pop out of their sockets. Then, that massive claw came back from out of the dark and wrapped around her neck. It squeezed slowly and I heard the cracking and grinding of the bones break. I watched her neck twist and her head fall limp, ending the screaming. Speechless, I simply laid there, watching as her limp body was dragged down the basement stairs. The air hangs silent but for the sound of dragging and the thump as her corpse hit every stair on the way down, eventually disappearing into the darkness. I lay there for a moment just staring at the darkness behind the basement door. I knew I should close it. I knew I should run, but I was terrified to move. Terrified to bring any attention to the fact that I was still in the room, lest it come for me next. I didn't have to do anything, though. After a minute or so of silence, the thumping and creaking of the stairs continued once more. This time, my discovery had stuck his head out from the door frame. A few strands of hair hung loosely from a shell made of his shoulder blades and ribcage. What had been his human eye was now black and bulging and split into two. The split down his chin was gone, with his separated jaw forming a mandible mouth that chittered at the sight of me. What had once been Jason had completely changed into something else. It was carcinization, evolution in its most unexpected, frightening form. The crab just looked at me for a moment, defenseless, shocked by its grotesqueness, ready to pay for my sins at the bite of a claw. But instead of attack, it simply reached up with its claw, grabbing the doorknob and shutting the door. I watched its eyes stare at me as it disappeared into the darkness. I'm trapped here. If I leave, I'll surely be arrested for murder, and who knows what will become of the crab. Will it be killed, or even be claimed as someone else's discovery? Despite everything, I still want the credit for discovering this terrible evolution. Maybe it would make all of this mean something. It has to mean something, otherwise it was just a mistake. One that ruined my life and ended two others. I can't just stay here either. Tonight the house burns down, the crab with it. I'm posting this in hopes that when everything is discovered, I'm still credited with the discovery. I'm calling it hypercarcinization, and I hope I'm remembered for the discovery. And I hope some kind of cure or preventative measure can be developed to make sure this never happens to someone again. After I post this, I'm going to take a long, drug-induced sleep. I only hope that I don't wake up to the flames, or worse, in the crab's den, with that horrible chittering maw and those dead black eyes staring back at me. Right, so I've been behind the bar at Le Petit for 5 years now. Usually dead normal, footy on the telly, regulars nursing their pints, that sort of thing. Just your average local pub in Lansnat, nothing special. But last night, bloody hell, something wasn't right. This bloke walks in and I'm not on about your average city worker. Proper posh he was. Expensive black suit that probably cost more than I make in a year. Gold-rimmed specs catching the light, just so perfectly trimmed silver beard. Even had this fancy ebony cane. The whole pub just went quiet in it. The way he moved, like he owned the place but didn't care to mention it. Gave me proper shivers, it did. Had the usual lot in. Thomas from the building site next door always goes on about his missus. Professor Clark in his tatty plaid shirt. Desperately needs new kit, that one. Some uni lads getting rowdy over the match. But Shimura? Bloody hell, he was acting well strange. Never seen him hit the whiskey like that before. Poor sod was sweating buckets, eyes darting about like he'd seen a ghost, clutching this briefcase under his table like it was made of gold. Got this young couple in the corner booth, too. You know the type, couldn't keep their hands to themselves. Proper loved up they were. Girl in a nice dress, bloke in what looked like university gear. Standard night, yeah? Then it got proper weird. Around midnight, it went bloody freezing. Not your normal November chill, I mean properly Arctic. The windows actually frosted over, and I'm not being dramatic. Checked the thermostat 3 times, all normal. Then the jazz cuts out. We always have jazz playing, bit of atmosphere and all that. And in that silence, Christ, I don't even want to write what I thought I heard. Like whispers, but not quite human, if you know what I mean. Shimura was having a right mare by this point. Shaking so bad he could barely hold his glass, kept muttering to himself. At one point, he reached into that briefcase and just stopped, like someone grabbed his hand. But there wasn't anyone near him, was there? His face went white as a sheet, and I swear I saw tears in his eyes. The couple stumbled out around 12:30, absolutely plastered. The posh bloke left right after them, didn't even finish his martini. Just stood up, gave me this look that made my blood run cold, and walked out smooth as you like. Shimura hung about till almost closing, still shaking like autumn leaves. This morning, police everywhere in Night Dew Gardens, just down the road. Yellow taped the lot. Keep thinking about that strange cold, those whispers, the way that posh bloke was watching everyone. Got the CCTV from last night. Haven't looked at it yet. If I'm honest, proper scared too. The way things felt last night, like something was watching, waiting. Don't know if I want to see what the cameras caught. Edit, bloody hell, just saw the news. 2 bodies found in Night Dew Gardens. Young couple, they're saying, think I know who they were. Should I tell the police about last night? About the posh bloke and Shimura? About those whispers? I keep hearing them now, even when I'm alone. Those bloody whispers. I don't know where this will go when I'm done recording. He told me that no matter what, as long as I use this thing, someone will remember what I did. I'm not all that concerned with being remembered, but it was a special gift for many years of appreciated service, so I'm gonna use it. Plus, I don't want the people I don't get to the end of the road to be forgotten. Maybe it's cheating, but I think I've earned the right to cheat just a little after all these years. I don't really remember how long it's been. I don't remember a lot except the signs and the directions and the people. It'd be bad faith for me to forget them. I think it's been a while, though. Long, hard road. I'll start with my routine. I've got a bus. I'm the driver, so they just call me driver. I've got this little space in the back with a hidden little hatch. I'll tell you a secret. It's not supposed to fit, I don't think, but it does. I think it was made just for me. I've got a cot in there, my own trunk, some supplies. I live on the bus, even when I'm not driving. I might have lived somewhere else before, but I don't think I'd know how to get back if I tried. Or that it'd feel like home anyways. There's this place that's between one thing and another. There's this wall that has something on the other side, some big community, or a bunch of communities, I'm not sure. Way opposite from it, there's this bright light I have to get to or from. Between the wall and the bright place, there's all sorts of things. Forests, sandy deserts, whole cities and towns. A lot of people I pick up tell me they're not supposed to be like that. They make perfect sense to me. I pick people up all throughout this jigsaw of landscape. I make sure they get where they need to go, safely. Or at least I try to. Sometimes I have a lot of passengers, oftentimes it's just the one. I don't really discriminate. As long as they put something in the box at my foot, I drive them. And if they're polite and don't try to do anything untoward, I let them go the whole way with me. It's a hard job sometimes. I think people think I'm sick. When I go to the wall, they tell me a lot that I can go on through, that I belong just as much as everyone else does. They make it sound like I'm coming home and stopping at the welcome mat like some fool. It hurts still sometimes, since if I didn't know where I was supposed to be, I wouldn't be driving the bus. The other hard part, much as I don't want to talk bad of folk, can be the passengers. Sometimes they get rowdy, sometimes they get confused, or they find out they don't like where I'm taking them, even though they asked me to bring them. Though that's not the thing that makes it hard. I can deal with people being rude or disappointed or a little shaky. It's when I mess up. If I mess up, someone doesn't go home, or someone gets hurt. Or maybe I don't know what happens, but I get left knowing I broke something, or I put my passengers already on the vehicle in trouble. I have a few rules to keep from messing up. Always make sure everyone has all the things they're supposed to. This includes all parts inside the vehicle, not forgetting any belongings. Making conversation, like any polite fellow should, and looking them in the eye while I do it. The most important rules are my 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Never park the bus off-road. Never drive off the road or even walk off it, unless I'm the only one who's going to suffer for it. And never ever think ill of my passengers, especially the ones in poor straits. I'll take anything you put in the box. I don't know what to do with most of it. But I noticed something a while back. If I let myself think poorly of someone who doesn't deserve it, the payment for service stops meaning something. And if it doesn't mean anything, if I let myself feel like I didn't get anything out of it, someone corrects the injustice. I used to be a real hothead, you know. Real jumpy, made a lot of mistakes. I lost too many passengers that way. Maybe it's good I'm keeping these tape record things. It'll keep me remembering my rules no matter what, and I'll make less mistakes. Oh, someone's walking up. Okay, so I was told I need to paint good pictures, with my voice. Right now I'm at a bus stop. It's kind of misty, all white and cold and running up the trees like spider webs. If I look out into the woods about me, I can kind of see people moving out there. Some animals. If I pay real close attention, adjust my glasses, and give it a good squint, I can tell which animals are actually people folk. Nobody cares much if the animals break any of the fancy laws about this place since they're wild. The bus stop itself is just a row of 6 benches, some wide, some tall. There's one with steps up to it and another with a ramp. Some people have long legs, but they still want to sit with other folk. They always make me smile, the little ingenuities that tell me people are trying to be kind. There's a sign with my bus rules on it, and there's a few pictures of cars you're supposed to watch for. Big old warning in red text that says, if you see a vehicle being driven by a non-designated driver, exercise caution. They might be unfit. I always double-check the sign. There's a bunch of postings on the old weathered pole it sits on. There's a big green circle around a photo of me and my bus, a real nice one where I'm looking right at you and smiling my best smile, tipping my old blue hat that says bus driver on a gold plate. There's a red X on a van of some kind, some others, a few more green circles. I appreciate the diligence. It tells me who to shout out as being up to no good and when to make reports. Oh, I think I rambled a bit, sorry. So there's this fellow coming up to the bus. He gets on the road fine. He's wearing this big old yellow jacket with a little yellow hat like he's expecting it to rain. He asks me if I've got room, sounding kind of uncertain, so I tip my hat and smile. And I say, yes, sir. So he puts a little red ball in my pay box, and I think that's real swell. I ask him to show me if he's got everything inside the vehicle. He pauses, then steps off for a second to pull a rolling travel case up the ramp. He nods, and he shows me his eyes. Hands. I can see he's got boots on, so he must have got feet. Or those would be his feet. I'm not supposed to pry unless I think somebody's up to no good or I get in trouble in more ways than one. I'll be honest, I've snooped before and it's never felt quite right. But the exception to the rule is, it's okay if someone is doing something wrong, since then you're free game in the eye of manners. It's important those times that I did it, that I made the call right. I don't usually want someone on my bus who can't follow rules here or off the bus, and when they've got a reason that makes sense, I usually have to take extra caution with them anyways. You never know who they might upset, and I never quite know when I've blurred the line enough letting them on, they're upset with me too. How are you doing today? Where are you heading? I pause at this point, check the road. Now I'm told my roads don't quite match other people's definitions, so I'll make it clear. If I'm in the city-type places, the roads behave like they should according to other people. Out in the wild spots, though, or the in-betweens, it gets kind of blurry. Now I know where these roads go, where it all connects, and I almost always know when I'm still on the road for certain. I think maybe that's why I exist. I don't think many other people do, or that they always want to walk them. What's got you riding instead of walking today, if I may ask? I followed up, polite as can be. It's usually a good gauging type of question, and nobody gets upset unless I press beyond politeness. I try not to, not often, unless I really need to. Things can go wrong real quick if I do, for me and for them. I heard someone has gotten really bold lately out on the roads. Robbers? The man's voice was choked like he was swallowing down water. I frowned a little, took a second. It's hard to tell sometimes if it's just how they speak or if it's something I need to get the kid out for. Bold? How bold? Anything I need to look out for? I asked, trying not to sound alarmed. Deer. Tall deer. Rumor is they think they need to throw themselves at the lights or something. I think they've listened to too many stories. The man stopped and choked once or twice mid-sentence, but went on at the same pace. It was like rapid-fire hiccups. You called them robbers, though? They stole a buggy's wheels. I think they maybe ate it, no idea. Quite peculiar. Well, where you headed? Gates. I think I'm ready to go inside. I smiled at the fellow. Genuine. He even tipped my hat like I like to do to show I'm earnest. "I wish you luck, pal." I couldn't say friend. Even if I'd already let them in, it made things awkward. I once went a whole 2 months without a single tooth in my mouth because I said it before someone had gotten on. Friends are different from passengers. You trust them, and you really, really do not want to give trust to someone you don't trust. I started driving. Felt a bit awkward delaying, but I knew something now I really needed to keep in mind. Watch for deer. I had a strange thought, didn't I do that before too? But I couldn't figure out when before was, and I had this brief moment where the road wasn't as clear, so I let it go unremembered. I'd say it took maybe 30-40 minutes before I noticed the hoofed banditos watching us. I'd gone from a straight road to clean, orderly clearings that went on for longer than you'd expect them to, all the way over a river while some waterfaring folks I was familiar with bubbled and waved at me. I noticed my passenger out my rear view, kind of tensing up when we went over the river. But aside from a quick check if he was okay, I didn't pry. I saw out of the corner of my vision an antler. It pulled back like shit, I'm no good with these things. Like a sock puppet that had been caught. Normally I think I'd find it almost endearing, like they were shy. But I'd been told these deer were doing something they weren't supposed to, so it meant I knew something that changed my perspective a bit. They'd taken something they weren't given. Maybe not something that'd make the world itself reel against them, but which made the good folks side-eye them. That meant if something went wrong, there might be a window where anything could happen. Someone might come to help, they might come in time, but they might not. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I just drove straight without thinking for a few minutes. I followed the road as I should, and it didn't stop making sense what the road was. But I let myself think on old things I wasn't supposed to, bad times, and I let them gain on us before I made the call. My hands shook when I did it too, and I could tell my passenger was on edge when I made it. "This is driver, I think someone's following me." "Acknowledged. This is Watchdog 1. We see you on monitor and got your sector. If we lose you, we need you to keep us updated. Do you need security intervention?" I'm not sure." I saw them, the deer that is, on both sides of the road. We passed some suburbia. I saw some folk look out at my bus through the windows, then go back to minding their business. Folk don't like to pry, not if they don't know for sure there's something worth prying into. I heard the distant clopping of hooves kind of in a pattern. They were following their own paths, the ones I don't usually drive on because they make some of my passengers uncomfortable. I stopped. It may seem stupid, but I stopped. A bus stop came up, and there was someone waiting on a tall bench who I wasn't even sure would quite fit on the bus. But I wanted to be a good driver, and I think the other part of me didn't want to keep going, even if I was close to finding a side road that'd get me where I needed to go faster. If I stayed in place, help would get there easier. Tell me what's what quicker. There was a whine as my wheels grinded to a halt. The door didn't open yet, but I was ready to pull the lever. I watched the tall fellow for a bit, drummed my fingers on the wheel. I wasn't quite being polite, didn't smile, look him in the eye, or tip my hat. But I thought selfish for a moment, like a real old giddy. It wasn't my problem until they got on, I told myself. But I corrected my rudeness. I took a breath, calmed my liver-spotted hands, and remembered how I'd gotten to the point the road seemed long and hard when I looked back on it. Not just hard. I smiled. I tipped my hat. I looked the tall feller in the eye, or what I thought was their eyes, and I think maybe they were nervous, or were waiting for me to seem like I wanted them on. They got on, bent like, what's the word, like origami, and fit right in. There was this strange, papery crack noise, and I glided my eyes right over them, making sure they had all things inside the vehicle. And then I saw those servid criminals pop up again. Their legs went too high. They had to bend down to look at me from the alleys and corners. It was easy for them, their necks were very long and didn't seem to have bones or much muscle. Their fat, antlered heads stared half soulless right at me and my two passengers. One had, when I pulled the lever to let the new guy on, snuck their head in through the door. Their head was right at my feet. It licked my boot. I kicked it in the face and it gave this droning screech as it suddenly reeled back. Its head got stuck in the door as I went to close it, going all on reflex now, its antlers scraping against the metal until it got itself out. I didn't let myself pull the lever back, give it an opening to stick its head back in. Its neck reeled like a fishing rod line being returned to rest. A rapid-fire snap and crack of something papery whispering all the way. The other deer, who had watched me do all this, quiet and judging, slowly reeled away. Some, I didn't see their body, just their long serpentine necks disappearing around corners. Others I watched clop off or flounder or whatever a deer did to leave a scene. I counted, real quick like. Maybe near a dozen. Was that a whole herd? I took a minute to calm down, asked the basic questions of my new passenger. Found out they wanted to do ballet. Thought that was real nice. Almost let slip a rude comment without thinking, wondering how they were supposed to do anything like that with a body like theirs. I then had to take a good few more minutes to let all the seething out when security arrived, checked everything out and gave me an all clear, and I tried to drive off. My bus was almost full by then, and I really needed to go. But it finally clicked that one of my tires was missing. The deer had taken one of my goddamn tires. No, not the tire, that's not quite right. The whole wheel. Those sons of goddamn. Sorry. Profanity got out. Don't mean to be rude. I smacked the wheel a few times, kept myself from honking at least. Security came back around and replaced the wheel, quick and easy like, and I eventually finished my day. It wasn't until I'd gotten the man in the yellow coat the whole way to the gates, until I'd dropped him off. Until I'd dropped at least a dozen others off, all at different places. Half wild-eyed between my spats of good-natured conversation and peacekeeping I was obligated to do as I watched for antlered thieves that I realized I'd made a mistake. I realized the tall man had never given me anything as payment for the ride, and I noticed at some point the man in the yellow coat wasn't talking quite so watery, that his coat was a little paler in color. I'm ashamed to admit I didn't notice until both had already gone through. As far as I can tell, they passed inspection just fine. Did everything they were supposed to, probably went on to live happy lives. The ball in the box isn't red anymore, it was blue now. I don't know when it got there, if it was put there by the faded coat fellow, but I'm fairly certain it wasn't the same object. Tiny bit smaller. Every other little thing was accounted for. I'd followed all my rules and all theirs the whole way, but I hadn't noticed. I'm just about to end shift, curl up in the bunk in the bus's secret space. I'm right over the little hatch, about to squeeze through. I'm parked by a river. I feel safe by the water. The folk in the water usually keep an eye on everything around them, are real vigilant, and much prefer to keep to themselves until something stops letting them. I see it staring out at the dark water as the moon gives me a peek at its secrets. A yellow coat made to ward off rain and a little yellow hat. Floating down the river, soaked through like it was never meant to be. It went under the bridge I'd parked next to like it wasn't bothered I'd noticed it, like there was nothing abnormal about its presence. Maybe there wasn't, really. I heard the click of a camera, I think, around then. I looked all about, my hands shaking a little as I gripped one of the old worn leather seats of my personal domain. I didn't see anyone who could have taken it, couldn't figure a reason why I'd hear such a noise. I saw one of the water folk looking up at me from the dark of the river's depths, their glowing eyes plain with concern. But I didn't feel all that much like talking right then. I was tired and it was rude to pry. I put a sign on my door, stared a bit too long at the door lever for reasons I couldn't tell you, checked the pay box, took out the things inside, counted every single one. Every other passenger had left something. I brought the trinkets, letters, and other items down with me and I shut the hatch. I'm gonna hit the stop button now. I was told not to be alarmed if I got little letters. I put some blank paper up on the ceiling, on some string. I was told words might appear there from strangers, that I should put up things I wanted to say to them right there next to them with little clips. I don't know what it means. All I know is someone's supposed to get a copy of this out somewhere, though I don't know how or where it's going or why. But could you do me a favor? I didn't do good today, I think. I'm getting too old, but I think I want to be remembered now. I want to be a good driver and get people where they need to go. If I stop recording, I apologize in advance. But I've got to retire eventually, and I don't know when that'll happen, or if I'll be doing it on purpose. Someone has to drive the bus. For now, that's me. When I was high school, from 2011 to 2015, there really weren't podcasts. You had your typical radio shows with the big voices of radio who just dominated it. Their voices would start your day every weekday morning, in between the music that you either hates or loved. I loved listening to the raspy treble in some of their voices, like Jim Kerr, or to hear the smoothness of someone's voice like Delilah. My favorite, of course, was Howard Stern. My dad let me listen to Stern's radio show, and I just absolutely adored it. The show was funny, brash, and crazy. By the time I started college and went to school for a business degree, podcasts started becoming really popular. It was a dream come true for me. I didn't need expensive equipment or to rent out a studio. I could stream it from my laptop. I saved up money from my job as an office assistant and got myself a good microphone. The rest was history. I started streaming on Spotify and YouTube mainly. I didn't make it as big as someone like Joe Rogan or a lot of these other guys, but I had a decently sizable following. My topic wasn't comedy, politics, or gossip. It was a true crime podcast, mainly covering crime in the rural Northeast since I lived in upstate New York. I felt that to be my proper niche. I covered current murders and even past ones, famous and obscure, that had happened in the region's history. I had to stop because I almost became a victim. The date was January 23rd, 2017. My podcast that I had was more of a hobby. On this day, a prostitute washed ashore in Maine near Acadia. Her mouth had been carved into a permanent smile and her eyelids were removed with precision. Her head had been cut off and crudely stitched back on. Her tongue and teeth had been removed. The rest of her body was intact save for words carved into her stomach. Whore of the Lord. I felt pretty gross as this would be my breakout, since I had a friend that worked for a major media outlet that kind of leaked me this info. I immediately did an episode, got 200,000 views after 5 days. That was the episode that put me on the map, and I began getting royalties. I felt good. I would do extra long episodes when I got new information about this gruesome murder. After a couple months, new info started slowing down. Then someone named Kenzie reached out, and she claimed to have worked with the victim. April 3rd, 2017. Episode 86. Interview with Kenzie, friend of the Acadia murder victim. Hello everybody, thank you for tuning in. This is Brian with Northeast Crime. Today is a special episode as I have a guest here with me that knew the victim of the Acadia murder. Hello, my name is Kenzie. The victim's name, which her family is asked to not reveal, will also not be revealed here. I want to respect that and make that boundary first and foremost. Kenzie began to tear up. I quietly pushed a box of tissues closer to her. You say she has a family. Were they involved while you two were working? You can say it. We are all adults. We were prostitutes. She would always tell me how her family wanted her to come back. She had issues with her dad, who ended up leaving when she was 16. After that, when she turned 18, she hooked up with some guys and started doing sex work. She was still in contact with her family regularly. Yes, I met her relatively early on in her career. Her and I started working for a more high-end person, and we'd do good parties, high-end orgies, masquerade balls, and even birthday and bachelor parties for rich families. Suffice to say, you guys made quite a bit of money. I love it. I voluntarily went into this. People think you're useless or abused or you're desperate and have nothing else. I had an overbearing family and found a way to make damn good money, that's it. My mom wanted me to go into finance or some shit. I'm 23 now and making 6 figures. So you're me-thing a stigma with sex work, which I can agree there is one, especially in this country. Do you think the stigma led to a lack of protection for you and your friend? Do you think it got her killed? Brian, that's a deep question, and this is something I believe, yes it is. Even if I'm just a hooker in some alleyway in a big city, or a high-end lady of the night as they call us, we still are putting ourselves out there and people still judge us harshly. In movies and even in real life when one of us gets murdered, of course it's one of them. They have no one to look or care for them. Every fucking time. Kenzie put her hand over her face and began to cry. Take all the time you need, Kenzie. I know this isn't easy. Kenzie took a deep breath, dabbed under her eyes with a tissue, and resumed. I'm not close with my family, but I call or text every once in a while. We don't agree, but we still care. We still send updates to show we care or to know we are doing well. The victim did the same thing with her family. We have people. She had people. All of us who fall victim to these sick fucks have people who care for us. Absolutely, I mean, even though so many believe that stereotype, it's disproven quite a bit. Exactly. Now, we didn't have pimps. We weren't owned. We were kind of contracted out. We kept nearly 70% of our earnings. The rest we just paid off a company that specializes in escorts. They do background checks on the guys that hired us. It was secure shit. But some assholes still fall through the cracks? Yeah. This one guy came to us. He had a well-trimmed beard and a nice body from what she told me. He was Caucasian, about 6 feet tall, and had brown hair. Everywhere was brown. His eyes were blue, and he had this tattoo on his left shoulder of a snake with some weird writing. That was it. What else stood out about him besides the tattoo? The victim said he was rough with her, real rough. They got in a room and he pushed her, threw shit, and ended up yanking her arm too hard that it caused a bruise. She didn't do anything with him. One of our security guards handled him. Then 2 months later, she's fucking dead. It's him. Have you told the police this info? Kenzie started snickering. What the fuck did we just talk about? They're the biggest part of the problem. They don't give a fuck about us. To them, we're criminals too. They think some sick pervert is just crime taking care of itself. Fuck them, dirty pigs. Well, Kenzie, thank you for entrusting me with this info. Seriously, I hope this helps catch this man and can give the victim's family closure. The episode lasted another hour and a half. I was contacted by the police to give another report on what was said, and was asked for permission to use the recording as evidence. 2 months after the episode went live, Kenzie washed up dead on the shore of Acadia, in the same fashion as the first victim. Some people started commenting under my videos that I was a piece of shit profiting off dead and tortured women. I half felt they were correct, but I reassured myself they weren't. I was bringing awareness to this awful shit, and I hope to bring the motherfucker to justice. June 13th, 2017, episode 95. This episode started off normal. I had a topic to discuss the murder and then segments of documented murders committed during the Salem witch trials. 10 minutes after I started, I received a call from the viewer phone. I wasn't taking calls today, but decided to answer it. Hello, this is Brian with True Crime Northeast. I'm not taking viewer calls today, but I decided to shake things up a bit. Where are you calling from, viewer? There was a deep breath on the other end of the line, then the sound of tapping. Hello? Hey, Brian. Let's get straight to the point. I'm the Acadia killer. The man's voice was a bit creepy, but it had to be an exaggeration. His voice mainly sounded average. I started to feel nervous. My hand began to shake. I did my best to remain calm and collected for the camera. I don't appreciate pranks when talking about heavy topics like this. It's not a prank. The first victim's name was Elisa. Verify with the police if it's correct. How the fuck else would I know? Ha 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 ha. Anyway, I loved the podcast you did with Kenzie. She was so overprotective of Elisa. She was there the night I got kicked out from Elisa's room. Man, they were all yelling. I knocked that little whore around pretty damn well. Gave her some bruising, as you know. I didn't know what to say or how to respond, so I came up with a generic question. Why do any of this? The killer laughed, his breathy laughs causing static over the phone. I bet you want to hear a story about how my mommy was a prostitute and didn't know my daddy, or how my parents beat and molested me, or some other Freudian bullshit. Truth is, I grew up in a wonderfully religious household. Not religious enough. I met some men who believed this shit was wrong. Sex isn't a commodity. So you hire prostitutes and murder people since you're so righteous? The time has come for consequences. People need to be made examples of. Jesus may have preached peace, but he used force against those selling commodities at the temple. Why did you seek out these services? Inner conflict? Do you like sex but feel guilty for it? The killer didn't respond immediately. There was noticeable silence for a minute. Hello? Listen here, you smug cocksucker. Do not use those words against me. I'm a man of harsh piety. What's the snake on your shoulder? The snake represents the serpent, the ones who tempted Eve, and then in turn Adam. The snake represents sin. It's there on me and my friends as a reminder that we all have the mark of the beast that we must cleanse from this earth and ourselves, one at a time. Stay tuned for the next one. The killer hung up. I couldn't go any further. I ended the episode. Some comments left under my videos still stated that I profited from their deaths, and also endangered the second girl. I kept convincing myself that wasn't the case. 3 weeks after that, a third body had been found in Albany with the same markings, bruises, and condition as the other 2 bodies. I felt scared, as the killings had now come closer to me in upstate New York. The cops knocked on my door and asked me a bunch of questions. Was the first girl's name really Elisa? I asked. The cop nodded. Now I felt even less safe. I denied that the killer contacted me in any other way. I even denied seeing any strange people or being followed. I wasn't stopping the podcast. I wanted this bastard to contact me again. September 21st, episode 98. If you're there, the line is open and waiting for you. You killed a woman in Albany now. Why the... The phone rang and I immediately answered. That wasn't a woman. That was a whore to be punished. And look at that, it wasn't a self-proclaimed classy one like the other ones claimed to be. She was a lowly one hustling in the filthy streets at night. You killed closer to where the podcast takes place. Was there a reason for that? I go where I'm needed. Who needs a murderer like you? The world. The world must know of what is happening, the reckoning to come. The serpent will not win. You seem to be a clean-cut and well-spoken man, but you sound unhinged. Do you have a history of mental illness? If God is mental illness to you, then you are lost. Bingo. I got this son of a bitch where I wanted him. My friend Alex, who usually watches in the distance, started aggressively shaking his head. No. I was painting a target on my back, which is what I wanted from this killer. I profited off those two girls, maybe even put the second in danger. So why not put an end to this? You still there, Brian the podcaster, defender of whores and sinners? I started to smirk. This bastard was unraveling. Yeah, I'm still here. Good. I hope you're listening. I heard the phone rustling, then heard a tap. A woman was whimpering and heavily breathing in the background. This is what happens to those who bring sin to this earth, who choose to defile against God himself. I heard something move. Then the woman began to scream. The killer laughed. I carved a different special message for you, Brian. You'll see it very soon. Leave the woman alone, you son of a bitch. Leave her the fuck alone. The killer ignored my pleas and continued to laugh. The woman's screaming ended, but the killer's laughing and sounds of cutting flesh remained. I will now fix her back up to get her ready for her debut as a new woman. You'll see in a couple of days, Brian. Good day. And 3 days later, the woman's body was found outside of the University of Buffalo campus without a head. Everything was the same as the previous 3 bodies, but the stomach carving was different. It said, "Hello, Brian." Police had shown up at my house and were told they needed to watch me, as they now felt I was in danger. Good. Hopefully I could draw this cocksucker out. My friend Alex hated my plan and yelled at me for even being in the middle of this. But this was the power of radio, the dream I had since I was a kid. Radio and media brought people together, brought shit to the light. This son of a bitch killing women, taking advantage of them, was going to be caught. Him and whoever he felt was backing him. September 24th, 2017, episode 99. The police, hidden from my cameras, had their recording devices set up. They wanted backups and sound experts and whatnot to hear all this shit, so maybe they can narrow in on the bastard. I started the intro, but the phone rang. You love this shit, don't you? I asked. I don't appreciate your tone. I can leave and let your podcast numbers dwindle, Brian. That wouldn't be good for you. Why do you call? I asked, reading it from one of the detective's notepads. I want to be heard. The message of salvation and violent redemption must be spread. And it's not just whores. No one is safe. I paused, then asked, what do you mean? Everyone is a sinner, some more than others. No one is safe from judgment, especially the wicked women I have slain. They were earning a living. What was wicked about them? Your ignorance is your undoing, Brian. You said I was a horrible sinner. Am I on the same level as these women? Yes. You profited from them, harbored them, and continued to defend them. We are not happy. We? I asked. I told you the man who discovered me when I was younger. The man who has shown me the way. Did you send anyone after me? Your crimes have gotten closer to me. Luke 21:28. So when all these things begin to happen, stand and look up, for your salvation is near. See you soon, Brian. The call ended. I ended the episode there. The next day, I woke up and saw the cops in the unmarked car across my street. I felt paranoid. This man or his cronies could strike at any moment. Then the doorbell rang. I looked outside and saw a man in a black hoodie running away. One of the cops started yelling, got out of the car and started chasing the man. I went out and, like a dumbass, opened the package. The cop that stayed was screaming at me not do it. I ignored him. Inside the package was a severed head with a crown of thorns. Shoved inside the mouth was what looked like a dildo. I dropped the package, feeling dizzy and nauseous. I almost fell off my porch. Scribbled on the outside of the box was a crude drawing of a serpent with the word Brian next to it. October 12th, 2017, episode 100. Sorry to everyone out there. As an update, the killer sent a mutilated, severed head to my door. He found out where I lived and is fucking with me. I have police protection and I have almost 250,000 subscribers behind me. Information is the ultimate tool and you will be taken down. The phone rang. I picked it up. The detective started recording. I hope you enjoyed the gift, Brian. It's a little bit of an indulgence for me. I've been so careful through it all. Gloves, hairnets, hazmat suits, burner phones, and using real estate with no tracing to me. What's your point? Do you want to be found? Silence. I heard an audible gulp. Well, it's your 100th episode, a milestone indeed, and you're doing nothing special for it? I'm talking to you. A knock at my door. A woman, an officer from the car, was screaming not to open it into the walkie-talkie. The woman undressed and a bomb was strapped to her. Everything happened in a blur, and I almost didn't believe it. She was crying. An explosion then occurred, sending debris everywhere, ringing in my ears. I stood up and sat down, getting my bearings. Why the fuck wasn't I moved into protection? They're using me as bait. That's okay, I need to catch this guy. I have to bring him out. The podcast was off. Then the phone rang again. I hope you enjoyed my gift. I don't have many more for you. I hope you see the error of your ways and repent. The call ended. I passed out. In the hospital, I was treated for a concussion and some deep gashes I didn't know I had. I also broke my arm somehow. I guess when I fell off the chair. I spoke to the detectives that were still up on the case. Another 2 bodies turned up, both of them this time being found in White Plains where I currently live. 2 bodies washed up, one in Albany, the one whose head was in the box and one blown up. Then 2 more near me. 6 women. The second one found in White Plains had a cross carved in her stomach. Stapled to her right arm was a note that read, "More to come, Brian." When I was discharged 2 weeks later, I was put up in a townhouse near the precinct. 2 officers watched outside and 1 stayed inside with me. I turned on the news. 3 more women found dead in White Plains, 2 of them prostitutes and 1 a stripper. All of them had my name carved into their stomachs. Then the good news came. A man was apprehended 3 blocks away, carrying a gun in the street. He matched the description Kenzie gave. Tall, built well, white, with clean brown hair and mustache. The tattoo of the serpent on his right shoulder was there too. When he was apprehended, he laughed, saying he planned it this way and salvation was near. The court case began. I was kept in a police van, hidden from the rest of the crowd out there. I climbed out of the back of the van and saw the man being hauled in by cops into the court. One man wearing a surgical mask and trench coat hopped the barrier. He started screaming salvation before being shot at. He opened up his jacket, revealing explosives. He set them off, killing himself, the cops escorting his friend and the serial killer. 2 days later, 5 men were found in a warehouse, written in the killer's notepad, each of them with the same tattoo of the serial killer. Cyanide was found at the scene, and a note saying salvation was taped to each of them. Since then, I quit the podcast and also changed my major to journalism. Never let the bad guys get away. It was nearing midnight, and the bus station was nearly deserted. I had missed my earlier bus, so I was stuck here waiting for the last one of the night. The dim fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long, flickering shadows across the cracked tile floor. A chill ran through the station, though whether it was from the cold or the eerie atmosphere, I couldn't tell. There was an old man sitting in the corner, muttering to himself. His lips moved, but no sound reached me. Occasionally, he'd glance my way with sunken eyes, and I'd quickly look down at my phone, pretending to scroll through messages. But my battery was almost dead, and soon the screen went black. No lifeline, no distraction, just me and the oppressive silence. The minutes dragged on. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It hadn't moved. The second hand was stuck, trembling as if it wanted to continue but couldn't muster the strength. That's when I noticed something odd. The shadows on the floor didn't match the room. One of them was longer than it should have been, stretching across the tiles toward me. I turned to see who it belonged to, but there was no one there. The shadow shifted, slowly creeping closer. I felt my pulse quicken as I backed up toward the vending machines. My footsteps echoed louder than they should have in the empty station. The old man in the corner stopped muttering and stared directly at me. His eyes widened and his mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. He pointed at something behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Slowly, I forced myself to glance over my shoulder. There was nothing there. Or at least that's what I told myself. But the air felt heavier, colder. I could feel something watching me, its gaze pressing down on me like a weight. The shadow on the floor continued to stretch toward me, growing darker and darker until it was an inky black void at my feet. The old man finally found his voice and screamed, "Don't let it take you." That broke the spell. I ran, my shoes slipping on the slick tiles as I bolted for the exit. The doors wouldn't budge. I pounded on the glass, yelling for help. But the street outside was empty, the streetlights flickering just like the ones inside. Behind me, I heard the sound of dragging footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. I turned around, pressing my back against the door, and saw it. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow, taller than any man, with no features except for 2 pinpricks of glowing red, where its eyes should have been. It moved toward me and the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged the air as I desperately tried to pull the door open. The old man screamed again, but this time it was cut short. I glanced over and saw him being swallowed by the same darkness that now surrounded the shadow. He didn't even struggle. He just sank into it, his eyes wide with terror. I don't know how I managed it, but the door finally gave way and I stumbled out onto the street. I ran without looking back, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, the bus station was gone. Not just empty, gone. In its place was an empty lot overgrown with weeds and littered with rubble. I never found out what that thing was, and I never went back to find out. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint buzzing of fluorescent lights and the dragging sound of footsteps coming closer. Trainers will tell you that you can't outrun a fork. The same principle applies to demons. For the first time in my life I have abs, but I can never look in a mirror again. I'm not an idiot. I tried other things first. Keto wasn't sustainable. I ate through the Ozempic. The gym is full of the sorts of people who join a gym, so I kept losing and gaining the same 20 pounds until we had a weight loss contest at work. It wasn't my health or self-esteem that motivated me to lose the weight. It was wanting to beat Kelsey, the office sociopath. She was a monster, but she didn't deserve what I did to her. None of them did. Kelsey was insufferable before the Biggest Loser contest. She was technically in customer service, but somehow was never on the phone. Instead, she patrolled the cubicle rows, randomly insulting people. I wasn't even going to sign up for the stupid contest until she popped up at my cube, droning on in her sing-song voice. OMG, isn't it the worst that they are doing this contest now? They should have done it in October, then you wouldn't have looked like pregnant Batman at the Halloween party. JK, you looked amazeballs. Ugh, Kelsey. The first weigh-in after we started, Kelsey was down 12 pounds in a week and was babbling to anyone who would listen about protein macros and fasted cardio. I was pretty sure she dropped water weight from stealing her kids' Adderall. She was sweating through her makeup, which was basically Mary Kay war paint, and her pupils were the size of bottle caps. There was no way I could beat her playing fair. So I didn't. My great-grandmother Oma Rabeler lived to 104, and even at the end, she wasn't sick, just bored. That's what my aunt said anyway. Family stories about Oma ranged from mostly true to straight-up Pennsylvania Dutch folklore. I heard all about how her rye cream cured my uncle's acne overnight, and her special Boilo drink made my mom's migraines go away. They even said that she saved a neighbor who had been in a house fire by healing his burns. The one thing I saw myself was the special diet. She did it for my cousin when she didn't fit her wedding dress. Oma did a prayer and gave her some stew to eat, and she legit was 30 pounds lighter in 2 days. Oma did the diet herself, maybe once a year or so, just for a day, and was never bigger than a size 2. I went to my family's house and found Oma's journals. The directions for the diet prayers and recipe were in German, on brittle old parchment, and not in her handwriting. It was titled Gebet zum Astaroth. The warning after it was English, and definitely Oma's blunt block letters. Do not use past 2 days. Do not look in the mirror when using. The closing prayer must be read by the second sundown. If you see the Elwetrish, stop immediately. I used Google Translate for the recipe, but left the prayers. I didn't want to know what I was saying. I felt guilty doing this. Nobody else in the contest was augmenting their cardio with powwow spells. Ever since I was a kid, I was fixated on fairness, by everyone playing by the same rules. Being a rule follower didn't exactly set me up for success in sales. which explained why I was struggling to make my numbers while Eddie and Martin, my morally flexible colleagues, were competing to see who could buy the tackiest luxury watch. I didn't want to cheat to win a stupid contest, but I just really needed Kelsey to lose. 2 days before the contest weigh-in, I said the first prayer and made the stew. The ingredients were weird, no, I won't list them, and combined to taste like a very salty pile of wet leaves. At the end of the first day, I was down 15 pounds and stayed up all night organizing sales leads, then emails, then my sock drawer. At the end of day 2, I was down 30 and none of my clothes fit. That should have been it. Second prayer and done. I didn't say the prayer. I stayed up again doing dumbbell workouts and thinking of ways to sabotage Eddie and Martin. The weigh-in on the third day felt too good. The look on Kelsey's face was delicious, and I was making more calls and closing more sales than I ever had before. I wanted it to keep going. I was forgetting things, though. I had to reset my computer password with IT 2 days in a row because I didn't write it down. I chalked it up to blood sugar. After I got my password figured out, I contacted quality assurance about Martin lying on his underwriting and sent proof. I made another batch of stew on my lunch break. The extra burst of energy got me through stealing, calling, and closing Eddie's leads. That night, I did a cardio walk for 3 hours while trying to remember my childhood address. I didn't panic. Lots of people get brain fog on a diet. Finally, at the end of the 4th day, I looked in the mirror. My body and face were unrecognizable. I was impossibly lean, skin pulled tight over long-buried muscles like leather stretched over steel. And I wasn't alone. A nightmarish bird had its talons in my shoulders. It was feeding on me. The alwetrish was not what they told me it was as a kid, not a creepy cute bird cryptid. It was a hateful perversion of a chicken. Instead of feathers, it had greasy black scales. Its eyes were malevolent violet orbs. Antlers rose out of its forehead and gored my aura, I guess. Somehow I knew that the shimmering colors around my reflection were part of what made me. And the beast was gnawing on me, pecking furiously with a leathery beak. It wasn't just eating the fat, it was eating my soul. I immediately read the second prayer and threw out the remaining stew. I went to bed and spent the night sleepless, rocking back and forth. What else had it eaten? My conscience, clearly. What memories? I shook, quizzing myself. Did I remember my parents? Yes, their names anyway. I couldn't picture their faces. My siblings and cousins were fuzzy. It was like trying to remember a dream. In the morning, I didn't look in the mirror, but I accidentally saw my reflection in the chrome toaster. The alwetrish wasn't feeding, just hovering angrily. That afternoon, security stood by Martin's desk while he put his personal belongings in a box. I felt nothing but realized that the me from 5 days ago would have been crushed with guilt. But if I was the me from 5 days ago, Martin would still have a job. That me wasn't coming back, just like Martin. I wondered if maybe I might revert back to my old nice self now that the prayers were said and I was back on normal food, small salads. My appetite wasn't what it used to be. Then Kelsey came to my desk. "You absolutely must share your diet with me," she said. There was no single-song voice this time. She was sincere. The next morning I read the prayer over Kelsey's desk silently as I gave her 2 days' worth of stew. I almost didn't give her the recipe. Almost. "Here are the directions if you really think you want more, but remember not to overdo it," I said. Technically, I warned her, right? That was on a Thursday. She didn't come in on Friday. I'd like to think that if she had, I would have done the second prayer. I'd like to think that. On Monday, she showed up to work looking like a zombie that worked at Sephora. Foundation and blush caked over hollowed cheeks and bulging orbital bones. She didn't show up on Tuesday, or ever again. Her funeral was the day of the final weigh-in. I ended up winning $500 from the prize pool for the contest. That was nothing compared to the commission I was going to make that month with Martin out of the company and his leads in my pocket. Eddie probably would have been suspicious about the leads I swiped from him, but he had other things to worry about. Someone sent screenshots of his instant messages with his assistant to his wife. He left the company soon afterwards. My memories didn't come back, but they didn't get worse after the second prayer. Same with my conscience. I haven't degenerated into being a supervillain, but you wouldn't want to be on a sales team with me. The real problem is the reflections, and not just my own. I have seen other things in people's computer screens and phones and tablets. I won't go near a public restroom mirror. It isn't just me. Everyone is surrounded by entities all the time. Most are just watching, but they all seem eager to feed. Many people have the sense that something is watching them, especially people with addictions. The one time I saw something feeding was in the reflection of my boss's desktop, right after he started drinking again. So I'm living with the knowledge that the Elwatrish is lurking behind my shoulder, and I'm mostly at peace with that. Except, keeping the weight off is a lot harder than losing it was. So is keeping up my sales numbers. As sick as it sounds, I miss how those first 2 days felt. I miss it enough to think that maybe this time I can control it. Just one day, maybe 2. I don't want anyone to get hurt again. But abs are made in the kitchen. When I was 7, my older cousin, let's call him Jake, told me about the Shadow Man. He said it was just a dumb story, meant to scare kids like me into behaving, but it stayed with me long after he'd left for the summer. The Shadow Man, according to Jake, wasn't like the monsters in fairy tales. He didn't live under the bed or hide in the basement. No, he stayed in your closet, waiting silently in the dark. He didn't need to eat or sleep or move much at all. He only cared about one thing, an open closet door. Jake said that if you left your closet even slightly open, the Shadow Man would come out when the lights went off. He'd stand there, watching you from the corner of your room, waiting for the perfect moment to step closer. Like those night terrors that always terrified me as well. You wouldn't see him clearly, only a shape in the dark, blacker than the darkness around him. And if you saw him and acknowledged him, that was it. He'd take you and no one would ever know what happened. Jake laughed when I started crying, but that night I made sure my closet door was shut tight. For years I couldn't sleep without checking it first. It became a habit even long after I convinced myself the Shadow Man wasn't real. Anyways, a few weeks ago, I moved into a new apartment. It's small, but it's mine, and I was excited to finally have a place to call my own. The first night I noticed the closet door didn't quite latch properly. It'd swing open just an inch or two if I didn't prop something against it. I laughed it off at first, thinking about Jake's stupid story. But as I got into bed, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling I'd had as a kid. I got up, shoved a chair against the closet door, went back to bed, and laughed at myself for behaving as such a child. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something scraping across the floor. My heart was pounding before I even opened my eyes. When I finally dared to look, the chair was pushed aside, and the closet door was open. Just a crack. I told myself it was nothing, just the draft from the window or the fact that the floor wasn't level. I got up, closed the door, and put the chair back, trying to ignore the cold sweat dripping down my back. The next night it happened again, and the night after that. But that night was different. I woke up to the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from the corner of the room. I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the closet door, now wide open, and the figure standing just inside. It wasn't moving, but I knew it was looking at me. The shadows around it seemed to ripple, pulling the air out of the room. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up this morning to find the closet door shut. I don't know if this was a figment of my imagination, if it was an all too realistic night terror, or if I actually experienced it for real. But one thing is certain. I live alone. You don't need to know me. All you need to know is I know something. Something I shouldn't. It's not mine to tell, but I don't think dead girls complain much. I see through her eyes. I feel that same pain. More than a memory, I live in the moments every second of every day. I have never been religious, but I pray to whatever will listen. I will tell her story. I know I have to. I don't know why, but someone has to hear her side of the story. Just promise you won't leave me. We'll stay together, all right? Yeah, whatever, I promise, she said as she slid her uniform off. I sat waiting, having already changed out of my work clothes the second my shift ended. Working in the theater had some perks, but it was hardly worth smelling like popcorn butter after. Rachel put perfume over the smell, but I showered after every shift. My hair was still damp as proof. Do you need anything before we leave? She asked, pulling clothes out of her bag to change into. Probably, I joked, trying to break my own tension. But it's my house, so if it's that important, I'll notice it on my way out. She laughed, buttoning the last of 4 buttons on her jeans. Then she threw on a tight Ringer t-shirt. Previously, it had some sort of image, but it had worn away with time, leaving it difficult to make out. I dressed nearly the opposite, with a plaid yellow skirt and matching button up top. A brown belt with a gold shining buckle and hoop earring to match. We weren't the type to be friends, really. We shouldn't have been. Work does that, brings different types of people together. Rachel hopped off the edge of my bed, grabbing her bag off my floor. She started out my door, forgetting her keys on my nightstand. "Rachel," I laughed, picking up the keys and following her out. "You won't make it far without these." She smiled, took the keys, and continued without a word. Her car was parked on the sidewalk in front of my house. I was never good with cars, but I knew for sure it was black. I think it was a Cutlass, but I wouldn't bet on it. She got into the driver's seat, but I hesitated. I didn't want to get in with her. I was scared, but it was too late. She planned all this out. I couldn't ruin it for her. So against my better judgment, I buckled myself into the passenger seat. If only she knew. The drive there was odd. Even Main Street had no traffic, leaving it a graveyard of stoplights and fallen leaves, fog blocking our view from every direction, growing thicker and thicker the further out of town we went. I would have expected more traffic with the carnival, but maybe all of the hustle and bustle happened already. Maybe we were late or something. I twiddled my thumbs, pretending as though I had nothing to worry about. "You okay?" Rachel asked, not taking her attention off the road. She always pointed out my little quirks, usually noticing if I was feeling off. I squeaked, snapping out of whatever trance I was in. I was obviously not okay. Rachel glanced over. She looked so calm and relaxed. "You sure?" "You look hella tense." I didn't answer. Cool air flooded in through Rachel's window, letting the smoke off her cigarette float out. Flickering neon lights stopped her before she could push any further. The lights lured us into an open field turned parking lot, like an anglerfish lures its prey. The old beauty, suffocated by the call of humming engines. The funhouse, bright, bold, colorful, hung upon the gateway. It looked so new and bright, as if maybe they'd just bought it today. I fumbled for the door handle, unable to muster up the strength to get it open. Vision fuzzy, heart pounding, and a headache I couldn't seem to shake off. Rachel came around and opened the door for me. I tumbled out, nearly knocking her over with me. I think she asked me something. I don't know. I blanked as if someone had burnt every last page in my mind. I got up and walked towards the entrance. It was too much. The lights, the laughing, the small crowded paths. But a calm smile and happy voice were as good of an act as the rest of the circus. I had never snuck out before. I was my parents' ideal child, and I loved it. The way every adult mentioned me as a role model, it kept me going. Like a push, I needed to function. Rachel grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the ring toss. "Would you be careful?" I begged as she pulled me past a girl, nearly sending her flying. Looking at the girl, she was younger, maybe 10 or 11. She looked odd. There was no other way to describe it. She dressed as though a few years behind style, a pale multicolored striped shirt and bright blue pants. Oddly, she had a microvision. They stopped making those back in 1981, if I remember right. But with how often Lance and Hyde mention it, how could I forget? That is only 3 years ago, though, so it's not too odd she has one. Looking around, everyone looked a few years behind. It was uncanny, but perhaps it was just my wild imagination. Rachel didn't seem to notice. Maybe it was nothing to worry about. Trying to find a good distraction, we played every game in reach. We, of course, won nothing. In the carnival, the house always wins. A blaring announcement shook my attention away from the horse race I'd been playing. "The show will commence in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Droned the announcer. "Stock up on snacks, carnival trinkets, and secure a prime seat. And of course, don't forget to enjoy the show." His tone implied that the enjoyment part was optional, but the snacks and trinkets were not. Rachel again grabbed my wrist, pulling me towards the tent. "Come on, we have to get in before the show starts." My heart was racing, my breath coming in short gasps as I stumbled after her. We passed all the game I had played, which oddly enough looked older than they had moments ago. Looking more closely, the grounds were almost empty. Where there had been many people moments ago, now all that wandered were the soulless carnival employees. The tent looked too small on the outside, and I assumed me and Rachel would be stuck on the sidelines without chairs for being late. I closed my eyes as I walked in, but it did nothing. Sweat, grease, and other smells didn't help my nerves. The air inside the tent was too thick to breathe. Without hesitation, Rachel threw herself towards the stairs, dragging me up behind her. Our feet pounded a rhythm against the weathered boards. I held my breath, begging myself not to feel sick. I failed, watery vomit splattered against the wooden steps. Whoa, she let go of my hand, covering her own mouth as if she might as well be sick too. Are you sure you're all right? I choked on my words. I wasn't all right. Yeah, I managed before continuing up the stairs. It was too late to back out now. We stumbled over feet trying to find open seats, but eventually we found what seemed to be the last two in the tent. As if time itself were waiting for us, the show started. The music swelled and the crowd erupted into cheers as the lights dimmed like embers in a dying fire pit. A single ray guided the eyes of the crowd towards the center of the ring. Then you saw him, one of the many clowns. He could have passed for ordinary, but he had long lost that privilege. A nice white button-up shirt, offset by his bright red pants and bow tie to match. His proportions were all wrong, like a child's drawing of a person. He had prosthetics. They were wooden, all different shades and types. Like he was made purely by the creator's twisted euphoria for torture. The effect? Like a train wreck you couldn't look away from. Hello, boys and girls, welcome to the fun house. He cheered, arms waving through the air like a weird vintage cartoon character. His tone was weirder, like a voice box, barely matching his mouth as he spoke. It didn't fit him. It was pitchy, too high, as if he'd sucked all the helium from a balloon. Here is where your dreams come true. Just wait. You'll see wonders of the world, mysteries never to be answered, and the most incredible tricks performed by our amazing actors. Now give a round of applause for the dancers. He stepped back and the stage darkened, as if he were the light keeping it lit. As if they had been there the whole time, they began their dance. Like shining dots in the dark, all emitting a light of their own. Their motions pulled the audience into awe. Dark blue leotards tightly clung to their bodies, black ruffles dancing beneath their skirts. Defying gravity, every leap just moments too long. Their ruffled skirts gave the effect of a black swan leaping from water, beautiful dark red ribbons in hand, the shade of long oxidized blood. They spun through hoops so quickly they sparked. Contrast to the world of the carnival, they were angels. After they finished their dance, they seemed to vanish. The ring, now lit up, showed 4 large trapeze ropes and 2 poles on opposite sides, stalking the stage for the next who dared to take its place. The additional lighting showed how large the tent really was. It hadn't appeared this big on the outside, only a few hundred feet. Looking at it now, it had to be at least 1,000 feet around, maybe more. A young woman and man climbed up on opposite platforms, their eyes locked. They had similar attire to the dancers, but no skirts or ribbons to match. They looked similar, both slim, brunette-haired. What I can only guess were siblings. They stood still for a moment, as if waiting for some sort of introduction. Without one, she stepped backwards to get a running start and dove. Her hands slammed against the bar, gripping tight as she swung towards her male counterpart. Time seemed to slow. She looked so focused, so certain. She trusted her every move and her partner just as much. As she neared him, the lights cut, drenching the world in dim, red darkness. Silence. It's frightening. The world isn't meant to be quiet. Silence is predator stalking prey. It's calm before the storm. Silence is pain in the making, a scream, the kind that causes nightmares and makes ears ring. One that speaks a million words, hopes and dreams, then crushes them all in a second. A scream of pain, loss and knowing. Knowing that you cannot win the game of life. That no matter what, life remains the constant victor. Without words, you knew what she begged. Screaming is the one language everyone speaks. The light snapped back on, but the scream didn't stop. The tent shuddered with the silence of the audience, only the screaming. Looking around, they were gone. Even the male trapeze had vanished, just like everyone else. Disappeared, to dirt across the floor, and the fear that she might not be alone. Looking ahead, she saw her, crushed by the pressure of her fall. The last moments of terror still frozen in her eyes, limbs twisted in each direction like a gory, broken compass guiding me nowhere. The dirt beneath her, a damp red, her corpse still screaming, the first normal scream mine. Frozen in place, everything seemed to unfold before me like a movie, and for a moment I prayed I was a part of the narrative. My knees gave way, sending me to the floor, barely leaving me conscious through the fear-induced nausea. It was too sudden, too real. The woman's screaming continued, beyond what her crushed torso should have allowed. Then, as if fate had pity on me for a moment, Blood gurgled up her throat, slowly muffling her agony. Leaning my shaking body against a chair, I looked towards where the door was. Fate did not pity me, it distracted me. Distracted so it could do something much worse. The door had vanished with no trace left behind, as if it had never been there at all. I looked around and saw what I should have known far before. There was no way out. Running down the stairs, I slipped and was reminded of my fear-induced vomit, now covering my yellow skirt. Nearing the bottom of the steps, I stopped. A sound echoed throughout the air, stopping me in my tracks. Skittering on the roof. Then I saw it. It tore through the roof of the tent with ease, but no light came in. A dark shade of gray-brown, 50, maybe 60 feet long, wrapping itself around the poles holding the place up. 10 long spider-like limbs stuck randomly to the body, as if added as an afterthought, all shifting as if they had minds of their own. 2 sockets where the eyes should have been, pulling the skin around them in like a black hole. Its smile, grotesque and mangled, the ends wrapped around edges of its head, showing horribly large, sharpened human teeth. Moving faster than my eyes could catch up with, it darted toward me. I dropped back to the floor. Sliding down the stairs, I scratched any available surface of skin. It slammed into the steps above me and crawled down right past me. It couldn't see. I crawled along the seat bottoms. Shaking every second, I wasn't pressed to the floor. It may not have been able to see me, but it could hear my every breath. After more than an hour of crawling, hiding, holding my breath, and repeating that vicious cycle, I reached a curtain. Barely open enough for me to fit through silently, I crawled in. Too frightened to breathe. For the fear it might hear me, I ran further inside. Hardly seeing where I was going, I ran in and out of every curtain and opening, praying for an escape. Each direction I tried left me more and more hopeless. After many failed attempts at tearing through the tent and looking behind every crate and rack I could find, I crumbled to the floor. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I hadn't taken the time to realize what really was destined to happen. I was not going to escape. I was stuck here, to rot away or die to that horrible monster outside this curtain. I had so much left to do, I wasn't ready to die. The thoughts hurt, and I pressed my nails into my palm. I heard it scurry across the ground outside. It hadn't forgotten I was there. I pressed my nails deeper into my skin, drawing blood. It wasn't good, but it took the pain in my head away, helping me focus my brain on something other than fear I couldn't control. Through my blurred vision, I saw a slightly open crate I was too panicked to notice before. Wiping my eyes, I walked over. Sliding the lid off, I looked inside. Human-sized doll parts. Some wooden, others porcelain, like those on the clown from the start of the show. I picked one up to look at just to see what they were. It was hollow. I slid the arm over my own, putting each finger into the correct slot. A perfect fit. The porcelain was cold on my skin, but the freckles dotted on it seemed to match my own. Each finger was built to bend, carefully crafted as if put together by hand. Moving my arm was comfortable, as if it was made for me. Putting it back, I stepped quietly back towards my spot on the floor. Then I felt it. Something moved from out in the ring. I stepped towards the curtain, making sure to stay out of sight of the thing I knew was out there. I glanced out into the dark, not wanting to see it looking back at me. A dim ray from the torn roof was the only light. In that light were scattered chairs, one of the trapeze poles, now broken, and the door, the same as how it had been before, as if it had never left. Without thought, I ran. My shoes pounded the dirt, echoes following me like bees to flowers. I was so close, close to safety, freedom, to the life I feared I'd lose tonight. Hope struck my heart. What strikes harder than hope? Something sharp. Just seconds away from the door, my stomach dropped. I was jerked back, my limbs crunched together by the grip of that thing. Mustering my last bit of strength, I got one look at it. Him. One. He looked human, more than he had before. Almost as if turning more human as he watched me suffer. Then my soon-to-be lifeless body was gouged into a broken trapeze pole. Slow, steady, dripping blood. My breathing labored through my punctured lungs. It hurt, not like you'd imagine. Like swallowing chlorine at the pool. The choking nausea, all the same. But it wasn't as quick. It lingered, like vinegar on my tongue. "Goodbye, Marilyn," a voice walking towards me. Rachel, my coworker, classmate, someone I considered my friend. Rachel stared at my dying body, and I realized she had no choice. She was a puppet doing as she was told. I saw it, the way she bowed her head. She didn't really want this, but I couldn't form the words to convince her otherwise. Marilyn's breathing slowed. Maybe she had been hallucinating, maybe not. But in her last moments, I swear I saw her killer become man. Then her breath grew slower and slower. The worst part about all of this, I don't get a death ending. No easy way out. Good, the man said as he lifted her corpse off of the pole. Her limbs drooped as blood coated her skin. You will remain here until we find him. Do I make myself clear, Rachel? Her head nodded in compliance, her voice hardly above a whisper. Of course, Father, my work has been done. He had good plans for her body, stitching her wounds, removing limbs to make place for those same antique toy parts she had seen before, predicting her own demise. Her eyes sewn open, dark blue buttons in their place. Marilyn, a name of the past, a life left behind. A new name, but the same old girl, Madame Louise, the marionette doll. I don't know who she is, and I don't know why I know her story. But whoever she may be, God have mercy on Marilyn. Balam Berry Kel Keligoy. That's what my grandma used to say. I loved her so much. But then she became strange. When I was little, my grandma often visited our house. We'd drink tea together and play games. She told me stories, baked delicious pies, and always knew how to make me smile. Grandma was a seer. People from the AUL came to her for fortunes. She had a special room for that, one with a heavy lock. Never go in there, she told me. I didn't question her. She had a way of making even her warnings sound magical. Our favorite game was hide and seek. Once I hid near the door to her forbidden room behind the curtain. I was waiting for her to find me when I heard a knock. Knock, knock. It came from the other side of the locked door. Kimball, I whispered. Grandma appeared out of nowhere. Her voice was sharp, her hands trembling as she pulled me away from the door. She scolded me, but later she smiled and gave me tea with pie. That's how she always was. Stern one moment, kind the next. But many days ago, Grandma got sick. Mom said her favorite flowers were hydrangeas and that I should buy her a bouquet. I opened my piggy bank, gathered all my coins, and we went to the bazaar. I wanted to buy 5 flowers, but Mom insisted on 4. Tranquil, she said. 4 flowers. 2 days ago, we went to Grandma's house. Relatives filled the living room. Her old visitors from the AUL were there too, whispering prayers. We all placed flowers by her photograph. That's when I asked, why won't we wake her up? I want to give her my flowers myself. Mom frowned. Her voice was quiet but firm. Ol Ulgen Balam, Olman Gilikwikida. I didn't understand. Dead, sleeping forever, how could she be? Grandma still visits me at night. One night she woke me again. Her face peeked from under my bed, her body dark blue like the evening sky. Balam, she said, her voice trembling. I told her I was tired and upset. I told her people were lying about her. I wanted her to wake up for real. She didn't answer, only smiled. Tonight, her voice woke me again. Balam Berry Kel Keligoy. I couldn't resist. I followed her into the dark living room. She stood by the forbidden door, taller than I remembered. Her blue skin stretched tight over her bones. She opened the door with ease. The lock was gone, and crawled inside on all 4s. It wasn't frightening. Not at first, it was strange. Keligoy, Balam. Her hand reached for mine. It was cold, colder than ice, and her grip was unbreakable. She pulled me toward the doorway. Inside, it was dark. The air smelled of earth, dust, and something metallic. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. I felt her pulling me deeper into the darkness. And now I can't remember how I managed to escape that place. It was after midnight when it all began. I was still at the studio working overtime. We had a massive project coming up, and I had spent the past few nights tackling some of the trickier animations. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then, a ping. An email notification broke the silence. I wasn't expecting anything, especially at that hour. Figured it was probably just spam, but curiosity got the better of me. The subject line read, "Remember me, Rachel?" No body text, just an attached image. It came from someone called Gareth A. I had no clue who that was. Never heard the name, but it struck an uncanny chord within me. Against my better judgment, I clicked it open. The photograph that appeared on my screen froze me in my chair. It was an old Polaroid photo, maybe from the late 90s. I was in it 6 or 7 years old in a park. The details were fuzzy, but I recognized the striped t-shirt I used to wear all the time. But it wasn't just me. Standing behind me in the photo was a boy in a bright orange coat. His face was turned toward my back, watching as I was on the swing, eyes pale blue, so light they were almost white. They looked off, not just because of their strange color, but because they seemed to stare through the photo. It was like he wasn't looking at the camera, but at me right now. His smile wasn't wide, not quite. It was more of a faint smirk, but it felt wrong. The corners of his lips were slightly uneven. One side tugged higher than the other. His cheeks were hollow, his skin bloated but stretched too tight over his face, giving him an almost deathly appearance. A chill ran down me. He looked like a drowned corpse. I forced myself to look away from his face and back to myself in the photo. My expression was just strange, frozen, stiff into my own thoughts, if I had any. My small hands gripped the swing's chain so tightly they looked bloodless. I stared at the portrait, my heart racing. Who was he? I couldn't remember ever knowing a boy who looked like him, nor named Gareth, as the sender's name suggested. But something about his face felt familiar, and the way he was looking at me, it wasn't just watching, it was like he was waiting. I shut the application. This wasn't worth my midnight oil. I thought to myself, maybe it was an old friend trying to play some uncanny prank. Getting rid of it would be a good idea. I reopened the email, hovering my cursor over the photo for a second longer. As I tried to move it to the trash icon, it began to behave erratically. It wasn't moving where I wanted it to. After a struggle of what felt like wrestling against an invisible force, I managed to delete the mail. Problem solved. Out of sight, out of mind. Or so I thought. I tried to throw myself back into work. The animations weren't going to finish themselves. As I tried to navigate to the assets folder to import the new models into a scene I was working on, the cursor misbehaved. In moments, it froze in place. I clicked, shook it, but it didn't respond. Soon, my screen began to flicker. I groaned and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. Maybe the system was just overheating. I was pushing it hard tonight. The flickering got worse. Jagged streaks of static ripped across the screen, distorting the monitor. No. I panicked, only hoping I had saved the work I had been working on for so long that night. The screen died momentarily, but it sprung back in a flash. It felt like a temporary crash, and everything went back to normal again. Anxious about my saved progress, I opened the engine only to find it was all gone. Not a trace. My assets folder was corrupted too, and all the media I had imported went missing. Another ping, another email. The subject read, "It's hard to forget what's lost." The email application opened by itself. I didn't like this, not one bit. I wanted to shut the system down, but I had to log out before I did that. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen. It had a body this time. It read, "You never acknowledged me, Rachel. You never remembered. But I always remembered you. You knocked my head off, Rachel. That was not very nice of you. You left me there in the cold. I didn't know how to swim." Attached was a photo I couldn't bear to look at for too long. The water was dark and still, and in the center of the frame, a bloated, lifeless body of a small boy in an orange coat face down, floating in a canal. The canal was a familiar one, exactly the one which was behind my childhood neighborhood in the nearing woods. The text continued, "I'm close, Rachel. I'm right here. You'll find me soon, for when we meet again. Don't forget to wave and smile, even if you cannot see me, but feel me close." The photo seemed to ripple as though the water within it had begun to move. My breath caught in my throat, and I shook my head, willing the image to make sense. But it didn't, and I had enough. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the laptop shut and yanked the power cord out of the wall. Fuck protocol. I didn't care. Grabbing my bag, I bolted out of the studio. Rushing through the lot, I frantically sat in my car, swinging the doors shut behind me with a loud clang. The night air was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. The overhead lights in the parking lot flickered sporadically. As I turned on the ignition, I finally caught a breath. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself. The engine sputtered to life, and I pulled out of the lot. At the first red light, I slumped back in my seat, letting out a shaky breath. The street was empty, eerily quiet. After almost a minute of waiting, the light finally turned green, and I began to move. That's when I heard it, a faint, unmistakable whisper. "Rachel?" childish, soft, and coming from my passenger seat. It took me by surprise, and my movements almost froze. I was foolish enough to look in the rearview mirror at the passenger seat as I drove away, hands on the wheel. A loud, blaring horn of a truck approaching by my side snapped me back to reality. It was a near miss, and I would have crashed had I not paid the little attention I did. My car swerved, tires screeching as I pulled over to the side of the road. I looked over at the passenger seat and it was empty. I drove off, unable to get my mind off everything that was bothering me. When I finally made it home, I was too rattled to do anything but lock the door behind me and lean against it, trying to steady myself. There was a mossy, deathly stench by the lounge near the kitchen. I shrugged it off as trash I forgot to throw away. I was very exhausted. I needed to get some sleep. I double-checked all the locks and decided to hit bed, shutting off all the lights behind me. Despite feeling head and hands, I did not feel drowsy. Not drowsy at all, especially after everything that happened that night. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. My mind refused to rest. Finally, just as sleep began to claim me, a piercing wail shattered the silence. The smoke detector. I bolted upright, heart pounding, the sound dissonant and warped. It sounded usual at first, but then it slowly grew into what was like a tormented child screaming. It was ugly to hear. Too ugly. It grew louder and louder until the detector finally crashed to the floor. Covering my ears, I stumbled into the living room in the darkness, where the sound was the loudest, churning into what now sounded like a symphony of shrieking, painful laughter. The dissonant cries died out. Above the receding, shrill wails I heard, rather felt footsteps, rapid, wet stomping, like boots sloshing through puddles, and giggling. The sound was faint, and now I think I heard it coming from the bathroom. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling, trying to gather courage. The giggling just stopped, an uneasy silence after the chaos. I did not dare to go to my bedroom. I knew there was something very wrong inside the flat. Just then I realized the faucet inside the bathroom had been on all this while. I could hear the faint rush of water fill the bathtub gradually. I could see the light switch on from under the bathroom door. It slowly began to creak open. It was the sole source of light in the pitch-black darkness of my apartment. My heart sank. I could see the water overflow from the tub, and a very disturbing sight before my eyes. The pale, lifeless corpse of the child in the orange coat slowly arose from the splashing water in the bathtub. His skin was shriveled and wrinkled, face pale and bloated, eyes bloodshot, as if he had fallen asleep underwater with his eyes open for years. His lips curled into that smirk from the photo earlier. But it grew wider this time, a smile. It seemed as if he had seen a distant friend after a long time. And then he waved, mechanically, almost like a puppet. The boy began to move, crawling out of the tub, limbs twisting eerily. He stood up, his small frame soaked in a wet orange coat. He croaked in a low, rasping voice, drowned in gurgling breaths forcing its way out. "Smee, le, for me, rat chell." I stumbled back, but before I could react, the bathroom door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The sound echoed through the apartment, leaving me in the suffocating darkness. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. It was dead silent. Then the footsteps began, wet, rapid, pounding toward my bedroom. I turned as now my bedroom door closed shut, as if something behind it did so deliberately. The lock slowly clicked from the inside, and from behind the door I heard it, soft, playful giggling, like a child playing a game of hide and seek. I've never told anyone this before, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. Something I saw as a child, a memory I thought I'd buried, has come back to haunt me. When I was in 4th grade, I watched a man die. It was a drizzly, overcast morning, the kind that makes the world feel gray and lifeless. I was hurrying to school, umbrella in hand, when I noticed him. A man in a tan jacket and gray slacks walking behind me. I'd passed him earlier, and I could feel him back there. When I'd veered around him, he had been scowling. His face seemed confused and angry. The way he moved, fast, jerky, stomping steps, made me nervous. He looked like he was looking for a fight. Suddenly I heard an explosive, pained grunt, followed by a sickening wet thud. I turned to see the man lying face down on the sidewalk. His body twitched, his legs jerking in unnatural spasms. "Sir?" My voice trembled. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer. His hands clawed at the wet pavement, his nails scraping across it with a sound that made my skin crawl. I froze, unsure of what to do, my heart pounding in my ears. Then instinct took over, and I ran to the nearest house, banging on the door. A middle-aged woman answered, her bathrobe hanging loosely over her frame. She squinted at me suspiciously through the screen, her hair a tangled mess. "Call an ambulance, that man fell," I yelled, pointing to where he lay on the sidewalk. Her frown deepened, but she nodded and shut the door without a word. I went back to the man. The rain was falling harder now, sending rivulets down his tan jacket. Not knowing what else to do, I held my umbrella over him, shielding him from the rain. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was blood. Thin black strands trickled from his nostrils, pooling on the ground beneath him. But it wasn't blood. It wasn't red, it was dark, glistening, almost oily. And it was moving, squirming. The strands writhed like worms, twisting and curling over each other. They forked and spread across the pavement in tangled, deliberate lines. One strand touched the toe of my shoe and curled around it, like a probing finger. Others snaked toward the curb, their movements too purposeful to be random. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The strands slithered over the curb and into the gutter, disappearing into the darkness below. When the ambulance arrived, the rain had stopped. I stood to the side, shivering as the paramedics lifted the man onto a stretcher and covered him with a sheet. A police officer approached me. "Did you see what happened?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. I nodded, swallowing hard. "He just fell." The officer scribbled something in a notebook, took my name, and told me to go on to school. I didn't tell him about the black strands. I didn't even know how to describe what I'd seen. That was over 30 years ago. I thought I'd forgotten about it, or pushed it into some dark corner of my mind. But a few weeks ago, I came across a video online. It showed a horsehair parasite emerging from a praying mantis. At first I was fascinated, then horrified. Thin black strands spilled out of the insect's body, writhing and twisting like living thread. The memory came rushing back, sharp and vivid. What I'd seen that day wasn't blood. Blood doesn't move like that. Blood doesn't slither. I started researching. Horsehair parasites aren't supposed to be able to infect humans. Scientists say it's impossible. But I know what I saw. It wasn't quite the same as a horsehair parasite. It was bigger, and it wasn't just moving randomly. It was escaping into the gutter, into our water, breeding. I think about the way the man scowled, his confused and bewildered anger. It's a look I've been seeing more and more lately on the faces around me and on the news. People snapping in traffic, screaming at cashiers, lashing out online. Worse things too. Rage spreading. I think about how more and more that rage seems to be flowing out, growing and infecting others, like a tangle of glistening black threads reaching out for all of us. When Henry perched himself atop that pine tree, I thought he'd just lost his damn mind. No amount of convincing from Jim or the sheriff could coax him down. He ascended into the canopy and never returned. Never returned alive, at least. He'd always been an eccentric. It wasn't easy living next door to Henry, but it certainly wasn't dull either. Between the small city of birdhouses he maintained around the perimeter of his two-story home, the free home-brewed mead that appeared on our doorstep the first of every month, and the early morning French horn recitals, he was a handful. I rather liked the ongoing spectacle, all things considered. Jim never really saw the humor in Henry's mania. That said, crippling agoraphobia has prevented me from leaving the house for almost a year now, so my threshold for what qualifies as entertainment is quite a low bar to clear. My husband was on his way to confront Henry about his newest hobby, metal detecting, when he first scaled that 20-foot tall pine in our backyard. It wasn't the act of metal detecting that bothered Jim. It was the many untended holes that vexed him. The 60-something-year-old found himself too lost in paroxysms of archaeological fervor to bother filling the quarries back up with soil after he made them. After days of steady excavation, it looked like Henry had been sweeping his property for landmines. That morning, Jim saw the man creeping towards the edge of the forest 30 yards from our kitchen window, and he sprang into action. If I'm recalling correctly, he shouted something like, "I'm going to nip this in the bud," as he jogged out the front door, which now carries a cruel cosmic irony when examined in retrospect. The scene unfolded before me through the dusty lens of our den's cheap telescope, which has a lovely panoramic view of the backyard and the thicket beyond from where we keep it. As much as it pains me to admit it, fear of the space outside my house has turned me into a bit of a snoop. Jim sauntered up to our neighbor, but Henry didn't turn around to greet him. Nor did he stop lurching forward. He didn't even react to Jim as far as I could tell. It was like he was moving in slow-motion autopilot. Although irritated, it wasn't like my husband's molten rage drove Henry to the top of that pine out of a concern for his safety. No matter what Jim did or said, Henry remained locked in an impenetrable trance. A man on a mission. He gave up on catching Henry's attention by the time he had made it 3/4 of the way up. As Jim started to walk back, I kept watching. Henry, the sleepwalker, never changed his pace. Each identical movement was eerily slow and deliberate. After reaching the apex, he positioned himself to face our home, extended both arms palms up in front of his chest, and became impossibly still. An unblinking gargoyle baking in the early morning summer sun. At least I thought he was stationary. When I checked on him an hour later through the telescope, however, he had spun his torso about 30 degrees west. Arms still extended, eyes still open, but his body had turned. Concerned and captivated in equal measure, I began observing him continuously. While I watched, nothing seemed to change, and I was becoming progressively unnerved by his uncanny stillness. But when I paused my vigil after about 20 minutes, something occurred to me. He was moving. I could tell when I brought my eye away from the telescope. Looking through the den window, his torso had clearly pivoted another 15 degrees clockwise. The motion was just so slow that I found it hard to perceive in real time. I put my eye back to the lens of the telescope. Henry's skin was developing a red sheen. His unblinking eyes were dry and tinged with brown specks, like overcooked egg whites. That's when I called the sheriff. The grizzled southerner and his doe-eyed deputy arrived quickly, seeing as they were only a 3-minute drive down the road. They stood at the base of that pine for an hour, but couldn't find the language to persuade Henry down either. Flustered and out of patience, the sheriff told us he would involve the fire department tomorrow if Henry remained in the tree. When night fell, I couldn't visualize Henry through the telescope anymore, but I could hear him, from our bedroom window, faintly sobbing somewhere in the blackness. I found myself posted up in the den before the sun even rose, my mind burning with curiosity. Black coffee trickled down my throat, warming my marrow. For a moment I felt ashamed of the excitement rumbling around in my chest. The more I reflected on the sensation, however, the more I understood it. Journalism used to be my life before the cumulative horrors I documented manifested as a crippling fear of the world. In the grand scheme of things, this stakeout was pathetic. It didn't hold a candle to what I had done before in a past life. But fascination, not dread, drove me to do it, and that held value. Henry had not moved from his steeple, and by the time the sun appeared over the horizon, he had stifled his tears. His biceps were red and swollen, likely muscle breakdown from keeping them outstretched in the same position for over 24 hours. A little after 8, Jim made his way downstairs. He was unusually quiet. Initially, I attributed his silence to low-level distress, secondary to Henry's unexplained behavior. When I finally noticed him, he was standing by the front door, away from the view of our neighbor's macabre display. I asked him if he was doing all right, and he replied with an affirmative grunt, so I left him be. Around noon, I felt a theory crystallize in my skull. Henry was twisting around the tree's axis with a pace and direction identical to yesterday's. He must be watching something, I thought. That's when it hit me. Henry was angling his eyes and his body to constantly face the sun. My mind scrambled to process this observation, but Jim's heavy breathing behind me broke my concentration. It scared the shit out of me because I didn't hear him approach. Startled, I urged him to explain what the hell he was doing. "Oh, fixing clock," he replied. Except there was no clock. In actuality, he had his face pressed to the window that was to the right of me. He was staring at something. I didn't want to believe it at first, but by the afternoon I was forced to confront the realization. From where I sat in the den, I could see Henry's back through the telescope, and when I moved my eye away, I could see Jim's back, silently gazing forward. Early that morning, he had been watching the sun rise from our front door, just the same as Henry had from atop the pine tree. My husband was following the trajectory as well. Before I could dial 911, the sheriff and his deputy appeared in my peripheral vision. My burst of relief was short-lived when I observed how they were walking. Their footfalls were languid and protracted, the same as Henry's had been yesterday. As their hands contacted two different pine trees in unison, I refocused the telescope on Henry. To my horror, they were not climbing the tree where my neighbor sat to rescue him. The possessed men were scaling their own trees, each equidistant from Henry's. In a state of detached shock, I moved a shaky hand to my notebook to jot down one last detail I had noticed about Henry. Tiny mushrooms had sprouted from his eye sockets, palms, and his open mouth. A robin rested on his forehead, nibbling at the growing fungus. A wave of primal terror washed over me, and I sprinted from the chair to my front door, pausing as my hand twisted the knob. I tried to force myself through the threshold. My head pivoted back to Jim for motivation, who hadn't moved an inch in spite of the noise of the chair and the telescope crashing to the floor when I sprang up. Unable to overcome my agoraphobia, I instead sat down on the doormat and placed my head in my hands. Whatever Henry succumbed to, it had spread to the sheriff, the deputy, and my husband. I contemplated calling 911, but what if it just spread to emergency medical services as well? I'm not sure how long I lingered there, catatonic. The blood-chilling wails of my husband returned my consciousness to my body. It had become night. The absence of natural light transformed Jim into a messy human puddle on the kitchen floor. I tiptoed over to my husband, doing my best to ignore the pangs of terror vibrating in my spine. He had simply crumbled where he stood when the sun set, kneeling unnaturally with his chest and torso leaning against the wall below our kitchen window. Despite knowing he wasn't, I asked if he was okay a handful of times, receiving no reply. Standing over him, I tilted his shoulder, trying to see his face. Jim limply fell over in response. He was still crying softly, eyes open but producing no tears. That's when I noticed his chest wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. When I found the courage to check, he had no pulse, and I lost consciousness. I woke up a few hours later. Through the telescope, I could see my husband perched on a pine tree of his own, arms outstretched and eyes still open. Hellish choreography modeled by Henry, mimicked by the sheriff, the deputy, and Jim. My current theory is as follows. Henry must have accidentally unearthed something old and terrible digging holes in his backyard. A parasitic fungus lying dormant under the soil, infecting everyone who went near with inhaled spores once it was exposed. I'm going to make it outside today. I'll grab a shovel from the garage and I'll fill every single hole Henry made with layers of dirt. Maybe I'll survive uninfected, but I suspect I will succumb to whatever this thing is as well. It's the least I can do to honor Jim's memory. I'm taking the time to document and post this for two reasons. First and foremost, don't end up like me. I hid from the world because it felt safer. But it wasn't safer, it was just easier, and I wasted precious time. Secondly, if you see anyone perched on a tree, eyes following the trajectory of the sun, burn the tree down or run. Whatever you do, cover your mouth, because that robin ingested some of the fungus that grew from Henry, and may disseminate the spores as far as it can fly. The start of its life cycle, it's unclear, and I think that, unfortunately, the world may have an answer to that question in a few days. Emily and I have been married for 4 years. We'd been trying for a baby for most of that time, with no success. Doctors couldn't find anything wrong with either of us. They just said to keep trying. Still, every negative test chipped away at us. At me. So, when Emily told me yesterday morning she was pregnant, I froze. Not because I wasn't happy, not because I wasn't ready, but because I knew for a fact that Emily hadn't been pregnant the night before. She stood there in the kitchen, holding her belly with one hand and a cup of tea in the other. Her stomach wasn't small. It looked swollen, round, like she was already several months along. "Are you okay?" she asked, tilting her head with a curious smile. "You've barely said a word." "How?" I stammered. "How far along are you?" Emily laughed like it was a ridiculous question. "I told you, silly. We're due any day now. You've been nesting like crazy these past few weeks. Did you not sleep well last night?" Her words felt like ice water on my skin. I couldn't remember the last time we'd tried for a baby. I couldn't even remember the last serious conversation we'd had about kids. Yet here she was, glowing, maternal, talking about our baby like it was an undeniable fact. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I spent most of it in our bedroom, trying to piece things together, trying to remember something, anything, that could explain this. But it was like my memories of the past few months had been scooped out and replaced with static. By dinner, I'd convinced myself it was some elaborate prank. Maybe Emily was testing me for some reason. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I was losing my mind. Then the nursery door caught my eye. We didn't have a nursery. The room down the hall had always been a spare room, cluttered with old furniture and boxes of forgotten junk. But when I pushed the door open, I was greeted by soft pastels, tiny stuffed animals, and a crib in the corner. Emily stood by the window, folding a stack of baby clothes. "Doesn't it feel real now?" she asked without turning around. Her voice was calm, soothing, but the words sent a shiver through me. "I told you everything would work out." "What is this?" I whispered. "Emily, what's going on?" She turned to me then, her smile widening in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I told you, sweetheart, we're having a baby." That night I couldn't sleep. Emily snored softly beside me, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. I stared at the ceiling, my chest tightening with every breath. Something was wrong. I didn't know how or why, but I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't normal. This wasn't real. At 3:12 a.m., I woke to a faint sound. It was coming from the nursery, a soft, rhythmic creaking like the rocking chair being moved back and forth. I didn't want to look. I told myself to stay in bed, to close my eyes and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But my body moved on its own, dragging me out of bed and down the hall. The nursery door was ajar, the light spilling onto the carpet. I pushed it open and my breath caught in my throat. The crib wasn't empty. Inside was something small. Wrapped tightly in a blanket, its head was oddly misshapen, its skin pale and waxy like an overripe fruit. It didn't cry or move. It just lay there, motionless, as if it was waiting for me to notice it. Behind me, Emily's voice broke the silence. "It's early," she said softly. "But they're perfect, don't you think?" I turned slowly. She was standing in the doorway, her face calm, serene, but her eyes gleamed with something foreign, something that wasn't my wife. "Emily," I whispered, "this isn't right, this isn't—" She stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her grip was cold, impossibly strong. "You've worked so hard for this," she said, her voice dripping with something that felt like pity. "Don't ruin it now." I woke up in bed, drenched in sweat. Emily was gone. The nursery door was shut tight, the house silent. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream. Then I heard the crying. It's been 3 days. Emily hasn't come back and I haven't been able to leave. Every time I try to step out the door, I find myself standing in the nursery instead, staring at the crib. The crying won't stop. It echoes through the walls, through my head, no matter where I go. I haven't looked inside the crib again. I'm too afraid of what I'll see. But I know it's waiting for me. And every time I close my eyes, I hear Emily's voice, soft and distant, whispering the same words over and over. "They're perfect. Don't ruin it now." I'm a police officer and have been for 3 years, so in no way am I a rookie. I say this because the other officers have never seen me as an equal. Maybe due to them all being over 40 and having known each other for years, so they usually don't listen to me, and I've even heard them mocking me behind my back. For the past 6 months, an elderly lady has come down to the station every week, sometimes multiple times a week, to deliver us home-baked donuts. The first time she came in with the donuts, she was very kind and soft-spoken but easy to talk to. Despite this, everyone down at the station was suspicious, with good reason, and we thoroughly analyzed the treats for any signs of contamination. All analyses came out clean, and there was enough for most of the officers to enjoy. I'm allergic to gluten, too. I never tried them. This went on for the next 6 months, with my coworkers being ecstatic every time that lady walked through the door. Last week was the last time she came in, and it went like usual. The lady walked through the door. Everyone turned their head and got up excitedly to greet her, already expecting the baked goods. And boy, did she deliver. Maybe an hour or so later, I was sat at my desk with my partner Shelley sat down at hers behind me. For the last 5 minutes, she had been complaining about a pain in her chest and eyes, and a couple of other officers had been complaining of dizziness and nausea. 5 minutes later, I was distracted by Shelley's heaving and forceful breathing. I turned around instinctively and tried to console her. That's when she began to violently regurgitate all over her keyboard and monitor. She collapsed on the floor and continued to throw up until she eventually lost consciousness. By then, all the officers were surrounding us, so while one officer called an ambulance, the rest of us carried her into the break room. Officer Tom stopped and stood frozen while some of us looked back. He said something along the lines of, "I don't feel good," out of breath, like he had just ran a marathon. He put his head in his hands, and a few seconds later he fell to his knees and began to violently vomit as well, clutching his stomach as he did. First Tom, then George, then Mike, then Margot, then Justin. The ambulance didn't have room for all of them, so more had to be called. A few days later, the autopsies came back showing traces of cyanide in their systems, and I immediately knew what had happened. All night we restlessly scoured, hunting that lady like animals only for no traces of her existence to be found. We knocked on doors, put out posters, but everyone we came across told us they had never seen us. We live in a small town, so this is not normal. I got home that night exhausted, but for some reason I knew in my head I would be unable to sleep. Maybe it was the feeling of guilt that after searching all night I hadn't found the person, no, the monster responsible for those stolen lives. I made my way into the living room, being distracted from my thoughts by the sound of the curtains blowing in the wind. The window was open, wide open almost shamelessly. I never leave my windows open, not even when at home. After standing there for a few seconds looking at the window, my heart frozen like the rest of my body, I began to walk towards it to close it. And once done, I thoroughly searched my apartment looking for an intruder. With every room I searched, my heart getting lighter and lighter, thinking everything was fine. I made it to my bedroom, and that's when my heart stopped again. There was a frantically taped up box sitting on my bed. I turned on the lights and walked towards my bedside table where I keep a switchblade in the drawer, but I hesitated before opening it, just staring at it, zoning out as my mind came up with all sorts of terrifying thoughts. I dragged the blade across the tape, my hands shaking as I did. My head was pounding with anxiety, and the thought that it could be a bomb completely missed me. What I saw inside was sickening. Prosthetics, makeup prosthetics, the type you see actors wear in movies, but I recognized that face. It was the old lady. Someone had been pretending to be an old lady, slowly gaining the trust of the officers at the station throughout those 6 months, just to take their lives. That same night, I didn't rest a second. I brought the box down to the station and stayed there all night. 6 weeks later, nothing had come up. Yesterday, a man was brought into the station after chasing down an old lady with a knife. I was asked to interrogate the man, and did so walking into the room and almost being pushed out the door by the stench. The room smelt like gasoline, urine, and burned flesh. The man, however, sat there, his arms crossed on the table, and his head submerged in them. I walked back out, closing the door behind me, and asked the other officers about the man. They told me they were unable to identify him due to the fact he had burned his fingerprints off, and most of his face. When they tried to check dental records, they realized the man had no teeth. He was a ghost, complete non-existent, as it wasn't for the fact he sat in the next room over waiting for me. I took a deep, shaky breath in and walked back into the room, the smell now being familiar but just as repulsive. The sound of the heavy door slamming shut didn't seem to startle the man. He looked like a mannequin. I sat down and introduced myself. I was expecting no response from the man until he slowly lifted his head up as if it was painful for him, and I tried so hard to hide my disgust. The little flesh he had still clinging onto his skull was badly burned, 3rd degree, and the little hair he had clung to his cranium in patches going down in thin, black and oily strands. He was wearing a purple turtleneck with rips and slashes all over it, not to mention what looked like dried bloodstains scattered all throughout it. I asked the man if he knew why I was talking to him, barely being able to focus on my own words. He smiled, revealing his toothless gums, and let out a soft, windy giggle. As I asked again, his laugh grew louder and louder until I lost my composure and banged on the cold metal table. I've never let my emotions get the best of me, but at this point I was shaking. I'll never forget the words he spoke in that same soft and windy voice. "Did you get my package?" When I got my first gray hairs, they were only on the left side of my head. It was a little weird, sure, but since it was only a few hairs, I chalked it up to randomness. But then, a few months later, as I was getting ready for a dinner party, I noticed something else. There were only fine lines under my left eye. The skin under my right eye was perfectly smooth. Everyone has a good side and a bad side, I thought. I guess my right is my good side. But as I looked at my face more closely, I noticed more differences. I had a slight jowl on my left jawline. Laugh lines, more gray hairs. Yet on my right, I looked like I was 25 years old. Not a single gray hair. Not a single wrinkle. Hair shiny and thick. I brought it up with my doctor, even asking about a stroke, but he claimed he couldn't see a difference between the sides of my face. Besides, I had no facial paralysis, and a stroke wouldn't affect the distribution of gray hair on my head. I brought it up with my husband John, too. He also said he couldn't tell the difference, but offered an interesting theory. Maybe your skin is more sun-damaged on the left because you drive so much, though that wouldn't explain the hair. When I got out of the shower, I stared at my naked body. It looked like the aging thing wasn't just my face. My left boob was saggier. The cellulite on my left thigh cut deeper. Now that I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. I looked totally asymmetric, like someone had taken half of a 35-year-old and half of a 25-year-old and stitched them together. I told my friends and my parents, and they also insisted they couldn't see what I was talking about. But to me, it was obvious. Weird thoughts seeped into my head that night. The right side of your face looks better than it did in your early 30s. It's restoring itself like you're a vampire or something. Some weird magical force is doing this, and there is payment, a sacrifice. You just don't know what it is yet. Youth is never free. I started researching online. I found an urban legend about a man who had the same issue. Half his face didn't age because he stuck his head in a particle accelerator and got hit with a proton beam. Anatoly Bugorsky, for anyone curious. Photos, however, didn't show an appreciable difference in the sides of his face. I began to feel like the right side of my body, the perfect, preserved young one, wasn't even part of me anymore. Like it was a growth, a tumor, a parasitic twin, like it didn't belong. When I looked in the mirror, a fantasy would play in my head, grabbing the kitchen knife and slicing myself in two. Watching the right half of my body crawl across the blood-stained tile, down the stairs, and out into the darkness, never to be seen again. A few weeks later, just when I started getting complacent, thinking maybe John and parents and friends were right, it happened. The right side of my face moved independently for the first time. I was brushing my hair in front of the mirror when I blinked, except only one eye blinked. What? I closed my eyes, but my right eye remained open, staring blankly back at me in the mirror. No, 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 no. I panicked. I did a series of expressions and movements. When I lifted my arms over my head, walked, moved my body, everything still worked as normal. But my right eye wouldn't cooperate. John rushed me to the ER. He thought I was having a stroke, but I had a horrible feeling whatever this was, the doctors couldn't fix. I closed my eyes as we drove to the hospital, trying to rest, but my right eye remained open. The road scrolling by through the window looked fuzzy and flickery, like my brain was only getting intermittent signals from it. A dying connection. I can't see right out of this eye, I told him. The engine vroomed in response as he pressed on the gas. Soon I was in a hospital room, nurses flocking around me, then doctors, pressing and probing and prodding. I just wanted to go home. I just wanted my face to look the same on both sides. I just wanted everything to be back to normal. The doctors here insisted they didn't see a difference either, but at my insistence they took tissue samples from both sides of my face. An hour later, a new doctor came in. I could feel the concern radiating off of him. He had bad news. I was sure of it. He told me with forced calm what the results were. The cells on the left side of my body were normal, aging at an appropriate rate. The cells on the right side of my body were in stasis. They resembled cells that were clinically frozen, like embryos for IVF, alive, but not functioning. Frozen in time. What would cause something like that? I stuttered. I don't know. To be honest, I've never seen anything like it. Is it dangerous? I don't know. We spent the night in the hospital with the doctors running more tests, taking more samples. Finally, not making any headway and not seeing a clear danger, they let us go home. John and I talked about it at length. We didn't know what to do. Tomorrow I'd be calling down the list of specialists the ER doctor had given me. I love you, he said, wrapping his arms around me. I love you too. I closed my eyes, but my right eye stayed open, watching the bedroom flicker in and out of darkness like a dying bulb. I woke with a start at 3 a.m. I tried to roll over, but realized I couldn't. My arm was stuck on something. I yanked hard, starting to panic. Had John rolled on my arm or something? What's going on? My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and then I saw exactly what was wrong. My right arm stretched out in the darkness, and my right hand was locked around John's throat. His eyes stared up at the ceiling, blank and lifeless. There are places all over the world where if you happen to make a wish at the right time, it will come true. I stumbled into one of these places last New Year, just outside the back door of a seedy old downtown disco with a group of friends. I had stepped out of the crowded, hot, sweaty club for a breath of fresh air, and even though I knew they would be ringing in the new year in a matter of minutes, I couldn't force myself to go back in. I stood there, leaning against the wall, and thought about her. For months I had been unable to think of anything else. And just on the stroke of 12, I groaned and loudly, from the bottom of my heart, asked for what I had been wishing for all these months. Ever since I met her, that Camilla would fall in love with me. It was pure coincidence that I was at that spot when I said those words. You have to believe me. I got her text seconds after. Happy Nye! Embellished with 5 red heart emojis. I felt a sense of shock. Camilla had never texted me anything personal during the time I had known her, and certainly nothing with red hearts. But soon delight overcame the shock as I texted back, and we flowed into a natural, beautiful conversation which ended with arranging for our first date. By February, she had moved in with me, breaking her lease to do so. I had been delirious with joy. My love for her did not lessen an iota, and she seemed to reciprocate just as passionately. Our friends were first stunned at this rapidly blooming relationship, but we both looked happy and everyone accepted her decision to be with me. It sounds crazy when I type it out like this, but I knew it was from the wishing place behind the old disco. A year passed, a year full of joy for me, and now we were at the same disco again. I looked at Camilla's beautiful face, lit up by the flashing disco lights. She gripped my arm. Nick, it's almost midnight. I hesitated and she frowned. You promised me, she yelled in the thumping music. Feeling like a condemned man, we started walking towards the back entrance, my heart flopping about in my chest with misery. Oh, how could I have been so foolish? Because I had told her about the wish and the place just a few weeks ago. Camilla didn't deny or withdraw her love. It was too strong, I could feel it. But she became insistent, and she made me promise to take her there this new year. She wanted a wish too. I tried to cajole her into telling me what her wish was, but she wouldn't. And she was so sweet and loving towards me that I soon gave up, melting into the bliss of being loved by her. After all, I didn't really think everything between us, our relationship, our love, was just based on some fantasy. How could I? But now, as the minutes raced closer to midnight, dread filled me. Camilla, please, I begged as the thumping noise of the disco faded and we stepped outside. Sweetheart, please tell me your wish. Camilla stopped just before the door and drew me close to her. She kissed me deeply and I felt like a drowning man gasping for air. This was real, I told myself, willing myself to believe. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the chilly night. The crowd behind us started chanting the countdown. Here, she called. I nodded miserably. How could I give her up? But maybe her wish had nothing to do with me. I remember thinking, maybe the force of our love would keep us bound together, as we had been throughout the past year, the most amazing year of life. Maybe she simply wanted to wish for a healthy life or success in her career, or some shit like that. To the left a bit, I muttered, and against my will, I positioned her on the exact spot where New Year wishes came true. 7, 6, 5, Camilla declared loudly. I wish to fall out of love with Nick, the man standing here beside me. Cheers erupted and fireworks lit the sky. I covered my face with my hands, a sob escaping me. I could feel the shift in the air between us. And so I didn't see the flash of steel until it was too late. Camilla bearing the sharp point of a knife deep into me with a soft grunt of fury. As I slumped over, my lifeblood spurting out through my fingers onto the cold, wet pavement, I heard was her whispering so viciously I could barely recognize her voice. You asshole. Die, motherfucker. Burn in hell. As the sound of her heels faded away into the night, I groaned out a feeble wish to stay alive. But I'm pretty sure it was just pure luck that a second later a couple stepped out, almost stumbling over me, and were able to save me, staunching the blood and calling for help. Luckily, the tip of Camilla's blade just missed vital spots. I never saw her again. Despite my recovery, I remained sickly, enfeebled, my days passing in a haze of regret and grief at losing love. I know the place won't work for me again, and nor would I ever make such a wish even if it did. This New Year, I stayed alone at home, staring outside the window at fireworks, listening to the joy of others, knowing that I might as well have died at her hands, as I am nothing but a living corpse without Camilla and her love. I don't know why I'm posting this. I guess I just need to get it out. For the past 2 weeks, I haven't been able to sleep without hearing footsteps behind me, without jumping at every car that pulls up next to me. There's a part of me that wants to forget it, but the other part knows I can't. Maybe writing this down will help me process it. 2 weeks ago, I was living my usual routine. I work from home, so my days blur together. That Friday evening, I had spent hours staring at a screen, replying to emails and typing up reports. It wasn't until around 8:30 p.m. that I realized I was out of coffee. I wasn't planning on leaving the apartment, but there was nothing else to do, and I really needed coffee if I was going to survive the weekend. I grabbed my keys, threw on my jacket, and headed out the door. It was the same 5-minute walk I took every time I needed something from the corner shop. Nothing special, just a normal evening, no different than any other. The streets weren't particularly busy, but they weren't deserted either. A few cars were parked along the curb, and I passed a couple of people walking in the opposite direction. The air was crisp, and I could see my breath as I exhaled. I remember thinking how peaceful the evening felt, like one of those quiet moments before something happens that makes you realize you should have been paying more attention. I didn't even give the van a second thought when I saw it parked outside the store. It was white, unmarked, with the engine off. There was no one around it, just an empty van. It wasn't the first time I'd seen something like that. People parked there all the time. I'm sure I wasn't the only one who thought it was out of place, but I didn't think much of it. Inside the store, everything was normal. The aisles were dimly lit, the shelves stocked with the usual items. The cashier barely looked at me when I grabbed my coffee and paid. There were no other customers, and it was oddly quiet. The flickering overhead light gave the place a strange atmosphere, but nothing about it screamed danger. I grabbed my change, said a quick thanks, and turned to leave. When I stepped outside, I saw the van again, the same one, but this time there was a man standing by it, talking on a cell phone. I remember noticing how he looked like he didn't fit in with the quiet street, like he was out of place. But again, I didn't think much of it. People talk on their phones all the time. I started walking back toward my apartment, my mind on the coffee I was about to make. And then I heard footsteps. It was subtle at first, just a soft echo of footsteps behind me. I told myself it was nothing, just someone walking at the same pace. But then it happened again. The footsteps matched mine. Whoever it was keeping pace with me, walking just a little too close. I glanced behind me, but didn't see anyone. I kept walking, trying to push the unease aside. But then the footsteps grew louder. Someone was definitely behind me now. I could hear them clearly, just a step or two behind. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just walking in the same direction, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I picked up my pace, the footsteps behind me quickened. I turned the corner onto my street, walking faster now, almost breaking into a jog. The footsteps matched my every move. My breathing became shallow, and panic set in. I glanced over my shoulder again, and there he was, the man from the van. He was standing just a few feet behind me now, staring straight ahead. I couldn't make out his face in the dim streetlight, but something in his posture made my blood run cold. He wasn't running after me, but he wasn't walking casually either. He was just there. Before I could even process what was happening, he grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the van. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was frozen, like my body was too terrified to react. His grip tightened around my wrist, and I was dragged across the street back to that damn van. I tried to pull away, but I was too weak. He shoved me inside, into the dark, cramped back seat of the van. I didn't even have time to think. The man slammed the door shut, and I felt a sharp prick in my neck. My head spun. I didn't lose consciousness completely, but everything started to blur. My thoughts felt foggy, like I wasn't sure if what was happening was real or just some kind of nightmare. The van drove for what felt like an eternity. The road was bumpy and I could feel every turn, but I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't process what was happening. I was too scared to even scream. When the van finally stopped, I didn't know where we were. The men didn't say anything. They just pulled me out of the van and led me into a small, windowless room. My head was spinning and I could barely stay upright. I was shoved into a chair, my arms restrained by zip ties. The room was bare, just concrete walls, a single light hanging from the ceiling, and a door that looked too solid to break through. And then, silence. It felt like I was in there for hours. No sounds, no voices, no movement. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat thumping loudly in my ears. I kept expecting them to say something, to explain what was happening, but nothing. No one came in. No one spoke to me. Not even a single question. I kept thinking, this can't be real, they'll let me go. This is just some mistake. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized how wrong I was. I wasn't going anywhere. Hours passed. I don't know how long, but it felt like days. I started to lose track of time, and I could feel myself slipping. My hands were numb from the restraints, my mind drifting in and out of clarity. Finally, someone came into the room, a man in a suit. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a moment, checked something off on a clipboard, and nodded. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I had the overwhelming sense that I was being watched. They cut the zip ties. Without a word, they forced me into the van again. I didn't protest. I didn't even try to ask questions. I just followed. I was too exhausted. The ride back felt shorter. This time, they didn't stop anywhere. The van drove through quiet streets, and when it finally stopped, they shoved me out of the door and onto the sidewalk. Just like that. The door slammed shut behind me, and the van sped off into the night. I was left standing there, not knowing what had just happened, not knowing why. I stood there for what felt like forever, too afraid to move. I don't know how I made it back to my apartment. I don't remember walking there. My body moved on autopilot. When I got inside, I locked the door and just sat in the dark. I was too terrified to even turn on the lights. I called the police, but when I told them what happened, they didn't believe me. They took my statement, but they couldn't find any evidence. No cameras, no witnesses, nothing. I haven't felt safe since. Every time I leave my apartment, I feel like someone is watching me. Every time I hear a van in the distance, my heart races. I don't know who those men were or why they took me. But the silence. That silence is the part that haunts me the most. What were they waiting for? Why didn't they say a word? The silence felt deliberate, like they were testing me, watching me, waiting for something. I still don't know if they'll come back. I don't know if I'm safe, and that uncertainty is the worst part.